The rain on Mill Road came down the way trouble always does. Sideways, fast. Without warning, he was driving carefully. She was watching the mirrors. Neither of them said why. There was a car behind them. Had been for a while. The kind of car that stays exactly far enough back to seem like nothing. The kind of distance that, in daylight on a dry road, you wouldn't notice. But she noticed. She didn't say anything. Because there are moments when you know something is wrong and you choose, for reasons you'll spend the rest of your life examining, to let the moment pass. The curve on Mill Road came up fast. Then the headlights behind them got very close, very suddenly. Then everything stopped. When he opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was not the road, not the rain, not her. It was a woman he hadn't expected, sitting in a chair that wasn't hers, holding coffee she hadn't touched, wearing guilt she couldn't hide, and the night was only beginning. The first thing Ryan Mitchell saw when he woke up was not a ceiling, not the water stain shaped like a boot above his own bed that he'd been meaning to fix for 3 years, not the fan he'd installed crooked and never corrected, not even the gray Tennessee sky through the window he always left cracked because he slept better with outside air, which his sister Nicole called insane, which Ryan had never stopped doing anyway. The first thing he saw was Sandra Callahan, sitting in a plastic chair that was clearly designed by someone who had never actually sat in one. Both hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee she hadn't touched. Eyes swollen in the way that happens when you've been crying long enough that your body gives up trying to look normal. Her cardigan buttoned wrong. One button off the whole way down, which Sandra Callahan, who ironed her dish towels and had once driven 40 minutes back to a restaurant because she'd undertipped by $3, would never have done on any ordinary morning. Ryan looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the ceiling. Not his ceiling, white and institutional, with a light fixture that hummed at exactly the frequency, designed to make humans feel marginally worse than they already did. His left leg felt like it belonged to a man who had lost an argument with asphalt. His arm had bandaging on it. Something behind his eyes was doing the kind of slow, rhythmic pounding that suggested his skull had recently had a disagreement with something harder than itself. Hospital. He was in a hospital. He looked back at Sandra. She realized he was awake at exactly the moment he realized he was awake. Her face did something complicated and fast. Relief, real, flooding, unchecked, for approximately half a second, and then something heavier moved in behind it. Something that didn't belong in the face of a woman who had just learned someone she cared about was conscious. Something that looked, if Ryan was reading it correctly, and he had spent 4 years learning to read Sandra Callahan's face so he was reading it correctly, like guilt, not the small kind. Not the kind you carry when you forgot someone's birthday or said the wrong thing at dinner. The kind you carry in your chest like a stone you don't know how to put down. The kind that makes you look at someone like you're afraid of what happens when you open your mouth. Ryan tried to say something. His throat disagreed with the plan. Sandra was already moving. She set the untouched coffee down and reached for the little plastic cup on the bedside table, the one with the bendy straw, the one that was somehow the most depressing object in a room full of depressing objects. And she held it toward him in a way that was simultaneously maternal and apologetic. He drank, because apparently surviving whatever had put him in this bed had temporarily dissolved whatever pride he normally carried about being a grown man who did not need to be handed water through a bendy straw by someone else's mother. For the record, Ryan Mitchell was 32 years old. He ran his own shop on Elm Street in Mill Haven, Tennessee, a small city that sat between two larger places, and was proud of exactly nothing and quietly comfortable with that. He made furniture, custom pieces, walnut dining tables and kitchen islands and built-in bookshelves for people who said things like, "We want something organic but upscale," and "Money's not really an object," and then spent 45 minutes arguing about which shade of stain matched their grandmother's sideboard. He was good at it, better than good. He could read a piece of wood the way some men read a room. Knowing what it wanted to be before it knew itself, finding the grain, understanding where the strength lived and where the fragility hid. He'd built things people kept for generations. He had a mortgage on a house with a crooked porch step he'd been meaning to fix. He had a drawer full of unmatched socks he kept promising himself he'd sort someday. He had lower back pain when it rained, which in Tennessee was roughly every other day, which meant his back had long since stopped being a surprise and become more of a daily correspondence. He was a man with a life. A built from nothing took him 10 years' life, and in that bed with the machine beeping next to him and Sandra Callahan looking at him like a confession she was afraid to say out loud. He felt approximately 12 years old. What happened? His voice came out wrong. Rough and thin, like sandpaper dragged across the wrong grain. Sandra's fingers tightened around the edge of the paper cup. There was an accident, not a question anymore. The bandaging, the beeping, the fact that his left leg felt like that. These were not the components of a Tuesday where everything went fine. What kind? Car accident. She looked toward the door, then back. You were on Mill Road. It was raining hard. She paused. A deer ran out. They think you swerved, they think. That phrase sat in the air between them like a splinter too deep to ignore. They think, he said, not a question. Just the words back at her. The police report isn't finished. Ryan looked at the ceiling again. The humming light fixture, the institutional white. The room smelled like antiseptic, and the kind of industrial cleaner that never finishes its job. He catalogued the sensations methodically because cataloging things was what he did when his brain was trying to catch up to a situation it hadn't anticipated. Cracked ribs, probably because each breath cost something. Left knee, something wrong with the ligament or the bone or both. Head. Definitely head. Why are you here? Sandra went still. Not the stillness of someone who didn't hear the question, the stillness of someone who heard it very clearly and was deciding, with visible effort, what to do with it. Here was the thing about Sandra Callahan that Ryan had known for 4 years and had never told anyone, including Sandra herself. She was the worst liar he had ever encountered. This was not an insult. It was almost an admiration. She could organize a church fundraiser with military precision. She could negotiate with florists. She had, on at least 2 occasions Ryan personally witnessed, reduced a contractor to apologies with a single raised eyebrow. But she could not hide a feeling if her life depended on it. Her face was entirely, catastrophically honest. Whatever she was feeling simply appeared on it, without her permission, the way weather appears, without announcement, without apology. Right now her face was full of something she desperately did not want him to see. I was called, she said. By who? The door opened. Kevin Webb. The name tag said it. Neat block letters, slightly crooked on the left. Came in with a clipboard. And the energy of someone who had been doing this long enough, that calm was structural rather than performed. Mid-30s, kind face. He moved through the room efficiently, checked the monitor, adjusted something, looked at Ryan with direct and unhurried attention. Can you tell me your name? Ryan Mitchell Sewell? Ryan told him. Do you know where you are? Hospital? He glanced at Kevin's expression. The smell confirms it. Kevin almost smiled. Sense of humor is intact. Depends who you ask. Kevin asked about pain. Ryan answered honestly, which was that everything hurt except his ego, because his ego had apparently fled the scene before the paramedics arrived. Kevin noted something on the clipboard. Said the doctor would be in within the hour. Told Ryan to use the call button if the pain sharpened. Said it the way people say things they need to say, rather than things they believe you'll actually do. Then he was gone. Sandra sat back down. Slowly, like her knees were thinking it over. Ryan studied her. My parents, she said, unprompted, like she was doing the math out loud. They're on a flight from Phoenix. Your sister's driving from Dayton. She should be here by. Sandra? She stopped. Why are you here? Her eyes filled, and the room changed. Same beeping. Same rain against the window. He could hear it now, a steady percussion against the glass. Somewhere down the corridor, someone laughed too loud at something that probably hadn't earned it. But Sandra Callahan looked at him the way you look at a door you've been hoping not to have to open. Ryan? Her voice came out careful, like she was carrying it in cupped hands. There are things you may not remember yet. What kind of things? The doctor said. With your concussion, the hours before the crash. They might be blurry. He closed his eyes. He was in his shop. That part was clear. 5:30, maybe 5:35. The light through the west window going amber, the way it did in October when the sun dropped fast. He'd been working on a piece of maple. Tabletop, straightforward commission, a couple in Brentwood, who'd changed their mind about the finish 3 times and would probably change it again. Springsteen on the radio. Not the famous record. The later one, the quiet one, that his father had played on long drives when Ryan was young, and that Ryan now played when he wanted to feel something he didn't want to explain. Then his phone had moved on the workbench, a text. Just the name on the screen, Laura. His chest did the thing it always did when her name appeared anywhere, the involuntary tightening. The stupid, unjustified, 2 years later response that his body refused to stop producing, no matter how many times his brain told it to behave, like a dog hearing the car of someone it once loved. Not currently expected. Just the sound of a car that once mattered enormously. Laura Callahan. They had been over for 23 months. He knew the number because he'd made himself stop counting at 23. And the number had stuck anyway. They'd ended not because the feeling ran out. It hadn't, which was the part he still didn't know what to do with, but because she had been offered something she'd spent years building toward, and he had been the kind of man who was better at standing still than at deciding what standing still was costing him. She'd been offered a position, coordinating a pediatric therapy program in a city 3 hours away. A real position, a built position, the kind of thing that didn't come twice. She'd told him about it at his kitchen table on a Thursday night in November, with the expression of someone who already knew what they wanted to do and was genuinely uncertain about only one variable, him. She'd looked at him across his own kitchen table, the one he'd made himself from reclaimed white oak, and she'd said, "What do you think I should do?" And Ryan, who was not a stupid man, who understood wood and angles and tension, and where things were likely to crack under pressure, Ryan had said, "You should take it." He had meant it as love, as proof that he wasn't the kind of man who held people back. He had felt, in the moment he said it, almost righteous, generous, like he was giving her something real. What he had actually done was hand her the door and wait in the hallway while she walked through it. She'd looked at him for a long time after he said it. Not angry, worse than angry, like someone who'd hoped for a different answer and had just received confirmation they hadn't allowed themselves to expect. "Okay," she'd said. Just that. 2 days later, she'd told him she was going. He'd said he understood. She'd said she knew. Neither of them said the things that were actually true, which were, "I don't want this to end. I'm afraid of asking for more than you can give. I love you, and I don't know what to do with that across 400 miles. They'd ended. Cleanly on paper. The kind of breakup people describe as mutual and mature that is in fact neither and is just two people being too careful to name what's actually happening. 23 months, he'd missed her. Not in the dramatic, operatic way that shows up in movies, just the ordinary missing. The kind that shows up on Tuesday nights when you cook more than you need. When someone on the radio says something you want to share, and there's no one to call. When you find a hair tie in the back of a kitchen drawer and stand there holding it longer than is reasonable. He'd missed Sandra's kitchen, too. The Sunday dinners. The birthday pies she made from scratch, even though she claimed she didn't like to bake. The way Sandra had, without discussion, begun treating him like someone she'd be keeping, rather than just the temporary company of her daughter's early 20s. The text had said, "And can we talk tonight?" He remembered that much now. What came after the text? How that text turned into the night that ended in this hospital bed with Sandra Callahan across from him, not telling him everything she knew. That part was still gauze. Still shapes without edges. He could feel the outline of it without seeing it directly. "I remember a text," he said. From Laura, Sandra's breath shifted. Was she in the accident? The silence lasted exactly long enough to be the worst kind. "Laura is alive." Sandra said it fast, deliberate. Then again, quieter. "She's alive." Like she needed to hear herself say it as much as she needed him to hear it. "She's here." In this hospital, something in Ryan's chest released and tightened at the same moment, which was physiologically improbable and emotionally accurate. "Is she? She's not hurt the way you are? That's not the same as fine, I know." He turned his head toward the window. The rain was steady and flat against the glass. October rain, the kind that wasn't dramatic, just persistent. The kind that showed up and intended to stay. "Sandra," he looked back at her. "What aren't you telling me?" She opened her mouth. The door opened before a single word came out. Laura Callahan stood in the doorway in a navy rain jacket damp at the shoulders, worn over hospital-issued scrubs. Blue too large, clearly not her clothes. Dark blonde hair twisted into a knot that had been neat at some point and was now making its own decisions. A bandage wrapped around her right wrist, white against her skin. A paper bag held in her unbandaged hand. Tired, she looked tired in the layered way that meant she hadn't slept and had also been through something that made sleep irrelevant for a while. There was a small cut near her left temple, just at the hairline, closed and clean but visible. She was also, and Ryan was aware this was an absurd thing to notice given all other available data. Exactly as she'd looked the last time he'd seen her, and also completely different. Like a song played in a different key that is still recognizably the same song. Her eyes moved over him in a single quick inventory. Face, arm, the monitor, the brace on his left leg. He watched her absorb all of it and try to look steady while she was doing it. She almost managed it. Almost. but her chin did one small involuntary tremor that she controlled in approximately half a second. He'd always known her tells, that one in particular. Then she lifted the paper bag. I brought you a muffin. Pause. Now that you're conscious, I'm reconsidering. You look like someone who might use baked goods irresponsibly. Ryan looked at her. Then at the bag. Then back at her. Because of course, not something simple. Not even hello. Not anything that would acknowledge the enormous weight of the last however many hours. A muffin critique. Delivered with the flat, dry precision of someone who had clearly spent the time between the crash and this doorway composing it. He smiled. It pulled at something in his face that wasn't happy about being pulled. He smiled anyway. Blueberry? Bran. Then I'm glad I survived to reject it in person. Something in her expression shifted. Just the edges. Just barely. Sandra made a sound that was trying to be a cough and was not a cough at all. Laura stepped into the room. She came to the side of the bed and put her hand on the railing. Not on him, just on the metal rail. Like she needed something solid under her palm. Her fingers were close to his. Close enough that his nervous system registered the proximity before his brain got around to forming an opinion about it. How's your head, she said. Full of questions. That's unfortunate. It was already crowded. Nice bedside manner. I'm off the clock. She said it lightly, but there was something under the lightness working hard to stay below the surface. He watched her avoid looking at the machine next to him. Watched her look instead at his arm, his face, the place on his leg where the brace sat, taking stock in the way of someone who needed to confirm the numbers before she could exhale. He looked at her wrist. The bandage. What happened there? Airbag. Some glass. She said it the way people say things when they've already decided the matter doesn't warrant elaboration. It's not significant. You were in the truck with me. She didn't answer at a speed that counted as answering. Sandra stood abruptly. I'll get more coffee. Mom, the word from Laura carried a frequency he recognized. Not asking her to stay. Warning her about something. Sandra froze halfway between the chair and the door. Ryan looked from one of them to the other. Both of them doing the thing where people know something, and are actively deciding how to portion it out, in what order, at what pace. He'd done it himself enough times to recognize the choreography from the inside. What aren't you telling me? Laura's face went a particular kind of pale. Not scared of the accident. Not scared of the hospital or the beeping machines or the way Ryan currently looked, which probably wasn't great. Scared of something else. Scared, maybe, of what he was going to remember or not remember, and what either outcome would mean for whatever was happening in this room right now. He shifted in the bed. Pain detonated up his left side, clean and sharp. Laura reached across without thinking. Her hand landed on his shoulder with a pressure that was gentle and certain. The automatic gesture of someone whose body remembered how to respond to him before her brain got around to asking permission. Don't. Her voice dropped. You'll pull something. Her palm was warm through the hospital gown. Her thumb moved once, almost nothing, like a reflex catching itself mid-motion. She felt it happen and didn't move her hand away. Neither did he. He looked up at her. The room had gotten quieter. The machine still beeped. The rain still ran down the glass. But something had compressed between them. All the months, all the unmade phone calls, all the ordinary Tuesday nights he'd cooked too much and said nothing to anyone. And it was all here now, crowding the bed. Laura, quiet. Just her name, nothing attached yet. Why were you in my truck? Her hand left his shoulder. She opened her mouth. Closed it. Looked away. Sandra closed her eyes briefly. And then Sandra Callahan, who was a terrible liar and who had clearly been holding this sentence since the moment Ryan's eyes opened, said it. Quietly. With the care of someone setting something fragile down on an uneven surface. Because you were taking her to dinner, Ryan. Her voice was steady and soft and absolutely devastating in its plainness. You asked my daughter to give you one more chance. The words arrived gently. They still knocked every organized thought out of his head in a single clean sweep. He looked at Laura. She was watching him with an expression that contained roughly 17 different things happening at once. Hope, old, cautious, the kind that's been kept in a drawer long enough to get a little crumpled. Hurt, the kind that doesn't announce itself, just sits. Something that might have been anger at the edges, or might have been fear dressed as anger. All of it visible, all of it hers, none of it hidden, because Laura had never been good at hiding things from him. Just like her mother. Catastrophically honest faces, both of them in entirely different registers. You don't remember, she said. Not quite a question. I remember your text. Her fingers found the bed rail again. I sent that after you called me. I called you first. For 26 minutes, something moved through her voice on the number. Something she hadn't fully smoothed out yet. You called for 26 minutes before I picked up. The monitor beside him registered something. He heard it without wanting to. What did I say? She looked at him for a long moment. You left a voicemail first, before I answered. You said if I didn't want to talk, you'd understand, that you'd been making me do the brave parts alone. And you were done with that. His chest was doing something that the monitor was now apparently very interested in documenting. What else? You said you missed me in ordinary ways. She said it carefully, like the words still had edges she was working around. You said you missed your shampoo being in my bathroom. A pause. You actually said your shampoo in my bathroom. You said it backwards. That sounds like me panicking. It was. What else? Her lashes lifted. The controlled thing and the uncontrolled thing fought for the same expression. You said you missed the way I park. Badly. You said I had the worst spatial reasoning of anyone you'd ever let near your truck and you missed it. Both of those things are true. You said. She stopped. Something about her mouth changed. You said you missed the way I pretend not to watch competitive baking shows on TV, while knowing every single contestant's complete backstory. Ryan felt something start moving in his chest that had been very still for 23 months. I don't know every contestant's backstory, Ryan. Her voice got quieter. There was a man named Paul on one of those shows. He underproofed his cornbread. You cried. He mentioned his grandmother raised him. In one sentence, it was a heavy sentence. Her lips did something. Not quite a smile. Too complicated for a smile. Something halfway between a smile and a thing that hadn't decided what it was yet. And for 1 second, right there, he could see her. The version of her that used to label leftovers in his fridge with passive-aggressive sticky notes. The version that danced to old Motown songs while making Sunday breakfast with a complete absence of rhythm and a complete absence of caring about that. The version that had once pulled him down by his work shirt at the end of a long day and kissed sawdust off his jaw and told him she loved how he smelled like a forest that had made some life choices. Then the almost smile faded and they were back in the hospital room. You asked if I'd have dinner with you, she said. Her voice had dropped again, low and careful. You said not to fix everything, just to start. And you said yes. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully decode. Layered and honest in spite of itself. I said yes. Sandra made another sound that had nothing to do with coughing. Sandra stood. I need actual coffee. The coffee I have is not acceptable, Mom. Laura's voice again. Warning frequency, honey, Sandra's voice back. Firm and gentle simultaneously. He should hear it from you. Sandra paused at the door. She looked at Ryan for a moment. The way someone looks at you when they've decided you've earned the thing they're about to say. For what it's worth, Ryan. Her voice was measured and warm and carrying something underneath both. When you called me, before you went to get her, you sounded like a man who had finally figured out which direction was forward. Then she was gone. The room settled into the kind of quiet that had texture to it. More to say on both sides and nowhere obvious to start. Ryan and Laura had been good at quiet, once. They'd had the fluency of two people who'd spent enough time together that silence became a language, rather than a gap. Morning quiet, with coffee and Laura's bare feet tucked under his thigh on the couch, and early light coming through the east-facing window. Workshop quiet, the evenings she'd sit at his old desk, doing case notes while he finished cuts in the next room, the sound of tools and the scratch of her pen and the radio low between them. The particular quiet of storms, when the power sometimes flickered, and they'd stay where they were, because neither of them felt any urgency to move. This quiet was different. Sharper at the edges, Laura lowered herself into Sandra's vacated chair, careful with her wrist. She sat with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, and the expression of someone who had pre-loaded conversation and was trying to decide which version to deploy. You called me from the shop, she said finally. I almost didn't answer. He waited. You'd left a voicemail before I picked up. You said. She stopped. Started again. You said you were done making me do the brave parts alone. Something about hearing it in her voice, instead of reconstructing it in his own head, made it land differently. Heavier, more real than the shape of it he'd been holding. That sounds like me, he said, terrifying myself and doing it anyway. It was. She looked at her folded hands. And then I picked up and you talked, for a while. You said. She chose words with the care he brought to grain selection. Not cutting against it. You said you'd been sitting with the wrong version of the story. The one where letting me go was the noble thing. And you said you'd stop believing that version. What did you say? I said I'd heard that before. Her voice was flat on it. Not cruel. Just true you'd said things before. Near things. Things that felt like they were about to become something, and then, she stopped. And then they didn't. I know, so I told you. She breathed. I told you that I was tired of being the person who read between your lines, and you said you understood. And then you said you wanted to tell me directly, without lines to read between, that you missed me. That you missed me in ways that weren't useful or manageable. And you asked if I'd have dinner with you. Miller's Steakhouse, Ryan said. She blinked. You remember that part? I remember. He stopped. He was reconstructing more than remembering, assembling the shape of the evening from the pieces he could reach. The shop. The phone. Her voice, when she'd finally answered. Guarded and then less guarded, and then something he hadn't been able to name on the call but could name now, sitting across from her in a hospital room. She'd sounded relieved. Like someone who'd been bracing for a storm and felt the barometric pressure change. I remember wanting to take you somewhere decent. I remember knowing you'd been to Miller's before. You said you'd order whatever they put in front of you without complaining. That sounds like a man making significant promises under emotional duress. Their steaks have asparagus on the side. I hate asparagus, I know. Something at the corner of her mouth. That's why I remember you saying it. He tried to sit up. His left side registered its strong objection. Laura's hand came back to his shoulder automatically. That same sure, unthinking pressure. Don't. Not irritated. Just direct. You have 2 cracked ribs on the left side. If you torque at that angle, you'll know about it for weeks. He settled back. Her hand stayed a beat longer this time before she moved it. The scrubs, he said. She looked down at them. My clothes were cut in the trauma bay. They loaned me these. You came from trauma, and then you came here. I was going to go home first. Change. Come back with something that wasn't. She gestured vaguely at herself. This, why didn't you? A beat. Small and significant. Because I didn't want to not be here when you woke up. That sentence did something to the rhythm the machine was tracking. He heard it. She heard it. Neither of them commented on it. Your wrist, he said again. The airbag deployed on my side too. There was some glass. She turned her hand over, looked at the bandaging matter-of-factly. The wrist got the worst of it. Nothing broken. Nothing that won't heal in a few weeks. And the cut by your temple. Same. Not as dramatic as it looks. You have a high bar for dramatic. She almost smiled again. Then it went away again. There was a rhythm developing to the almost smiles. They kept appearing and then getting overtaken by something larger, something she was managing carefully, some front behind her eyes she hadn't decided what to do with yet. What's the part you're not saying? He said. She was quiet for a moment. When you called me, she said, looking at her hands. I picked up because of the voicemail, because you said you'd been making me do the brave parts alone. She raised her eyes to his. I'd been thinking something like that for 2 years without having words for it. And then you put words on it. And I picked up. I'm glad you picked up. I believed you very fast. Her voice tightened slightly at the edges. When you were talking, I believed you faster than I wanted to. And then I hated myself a little for that. Why? Because I'd believed you before. The near things. The almost moments. And I'd gotten very good at. She stopped. Then, I'd gotten very good at taking the almost and deciding it was enough. And then deciding it wasn't. And then rebuilding myself back to fine. She looked at him directly. And you called. And I believed you in maybe the first 3 minutes, and I didn't want to be someone who did that. You're not foolish for believing someone who meant it. I know that now. I knew it then, sort of. But knowing a thing and not feeling the fear underneath it are different sports entirely. He reached across the small distance. Slowly, his left side argued. He did it anyway. He turned his palm up on the blanket. The old gesture, the one they'd had a language around, the one that meant I'm here, no conditions attached. And he waited. Laura looked at his hand for a long time, then she placed her fingers into his. Careful, warm. Familiar in the way of something your body remembers before your brain catches up, like the weight of a tool you've used for years and set down and picked up again. His thumb moved across her knuckles, gently, avoiding the edge of the bandage. I'm sorry, he said. Her eyes filled immediately. He'd been bracing for that, and it still nearly finished him. You don't have to do this while you're on painkillers. They haven't given me anything yet. I've just been lying here suffering with quiet dignity. A sound escaped her. Something between a laugh and something else entirely, Laura. He made her name something deliberate, not just a label. An address, the way you address something that matters. I let you stand outside a lit house for 2 years. I handed you the door and waited in the hallway and told myself that was generous. I know what I did. I'm not asking you to pretend I didn't do it. She was quiet. I'm asking you to let me be different now. Not because I almost died. Because I've known what I was doing wrong for most of 2 years, and I kept choosing the easier version of it anyway. He paused. I stopped being willing to do that. That's what the phone call was. That's what the dinner was supposed to be. Something shifted in her expression, moving through several stages the way a weather system does. The pressure change first, then the stillness before, then the thing itself. I wanted you to ask me to stay, she said. Her voice was steady, precise in the way she was precise about things that mattered. I want you to understand what I mean when I say that. I didn't need you to solve the distance. I didn't need a plan in a parking lot. I needed to know that losing me was something you were going to fight against. She paused, not once. As a practice, I know that now, you knew it then too, no anger in it, just accurate. He couldn't argue with that. Yeah, I did. I knew it, and I chose the quieter version because the quieter version didn't risk anything. He looked at her directly, which is the exact definition of what I was doing wrong. Outside, rain. Inside, beeping and the particular hush of a building that processes human crisis all day, and has learned to be quiet about it. Laura hadn't let go of his hand. She didn't look like she was planning to. The door opened, Kevin Webb again, this time accompanied by someone Ryan hadn't seen yet, a woman in her 50s with silver at her temples and flat-soled shoes that made no sound entering a room. She wore a jacket, not scrubs, not a white coat, something between professional and civilian. She held a small notebook. Laura went still in a way that was different from other stillnesses. Mr. Mitchell, the woman's voice was measured and direct. I'm Detective Margaret Carver. I'm sorry to come in while you're getting your bearings. I'll keep this brief. Ryan looked at her, then at Laura. Laura was looking at the detective's notebook with the careful expression of someone who already knew this conversation was coming and had been deciding what to say. Do either of you remember anything about the moments before the crash? Rain, Laura said. It was raining hard. Ryan was driving carefully. He lectures strangers about tire tread in parking lots, Ryan added. He was taking it slow. Something at the corner of Carver's mouth acknowledged this without committing to it. And before Mill Road? Can you walk me through where you'd been? His shop on Elm Street, Laura said. We left there together. We were heading to Miller's Steakhouse on Highway 41. Had either of you been drinking? No, was there anything distracting you? Phone use, argument, anything that took your attention off the road? His phone was in the center console, Laura said. He put it there when we got in the truck. She stopped very briefly. He said he didn't want to ruin his second chance by checking it. Carver wrote something, looked up. You're both confident the vehicle was operating normally before the road? Yes, Ryan said. Carver looked at her notebook, then at both of them. The look of someone who has information they are measuring carefully before deploying it. There was no deer. She said. The room cooled. Ryan looked at her. Laura's hand tightened in his, barely, but he felt it. There are no tracks, Carver continued. No physical evidence on the roadway consistent with a large animal crossing. However, she paused, and the pause was doing real work. A passing motorist reported a dark-colored SUV departing the area at high speed, just before our first responders arrived. We are currently reviewing footage from 2 traffic cameras in the area. Silence. Ryan looked at Laura. Laura was looking at the blanket near his knee. She wasn't scared of the accident. He could see that now. He'd seen it since she walked through the door. Whatever she'd been carrying into this room, it wasn't the crash itself. The crash was almost incidental to the fear she'd arrived with. Laura, he said quietly. She raised her eyes. Tell me. She pulled her hand back from his, gently, not anger. Something more complicated than anger. She sat with her hands in her lap for a moment, working through something. My ex-fiancé drives a black SUV, she said. Ford Explorer. His name is Brandon Ashby. The monitor beside Ryan logged the next several seconds without commentary. He processed this, ex-fiancé. He had known, in the general way of a person who hadn't been paying careful enough attention to someone else's life for 2 years, that Laura had dated someone after him. Of course she had. She was 31 years old, and she was Laura, and the idea that she'd spent 23 months in the same suspended state he'd been in was. He hadn't let himself think about that, because thinking about it had been too tangled up in things he hadn't been ready to examine. But fiancé was a word with mass to it. Ex-fiancé was a word with mass and velocity. And sitting in a hospital bed with his leg braced and 2 cracked ribs and the wreckage of a truck he'd been driving, it arrived like a second impact, lower and slower than the first. How long were you with him? He said. His voice came out even. He was grateful for that. About 10 months she was watching him. He proposed after 7. I said yes. She looked at her hands. I gave the ring back 3 weeks later. Why? Because she stopped. When she started again, the words were measured and honest, in the way that Sandra's face was honest. Completely and against her own preference. Because I said yes in front of his entire family at a restaurant, with everyone watching, and I panicked. And then I spent 3 weeks trying to convince myself it was fine. And then I stopped. Did you love him? She considered the question. Not the way someone considers a question they don't know the answer to. The way someone considers a question they know the answer to and are deciding how honestly to say it. I thought I was trying to, she said. The distinction landed. He didn't say anything. He had everything on paper. She said, plans and calendars and… She paused. He knew what kind of countertops he wanted in a kitchen. He'd thought about it. He had an opinion. She looked at Ryan. You can make an argument that's not an insult. As a professional, I have complicated feelings about countertop certainty, almost smile. Gone again. He was. She searched. He was the version of stable that looks right from every angle and doesn't feel like anything from the inside. She said it plainly. Without cruelty toward Brandon, without performance for Ryan's benefit. Just the fact of it, stated the way she stated things when she'd gotten to the bottom of something and there was nothing left to dress up. He didn't handle it well, she said. The breakup. He cycled. Apologies that became accusations in the middle of the sentence. Accusations that circled back to apologies. He showed up at my clinic 2 weeks after. He called. He sent things to my office. I blocked his number a month ago. Detective Carver had been quiet through all of this, writing steadily. Now she looked up. Did he know you were with Mr. Mitchell tonight? Laura's jaw moved. He came to my clinic last week, she said. I was eating lunch. He wanted to talk. I told him there wasn't anything to talk about. Her voice went quiet but didn't break. He asked if it was because of you. He asked if I was getting back together with… She stopped. I said your name. I was angry and I wanted him to understand there was no door open. So I said your name. She looked at Ryan. I'm sorry, don't be, he said it clearly. Don't be sorry for saying my name. Carver wrote something down. Looked up at both of them with the expression of someone who has seen this pattern before, and is about 2 steps ahead of the conversation, but is letting it arrive at its own pace. If Mr. Ashby contacts either of you, she said, you don't respond, you call me directly. She set a card on the table near the water cup. I'll have more questions for both of you in the morning. Tonight, rest. She looked at Kevin, who had been standing near the door, then at Ryan. If anything comes back to you about the crash, sounds, lights, anything peripheral, call that number. She was gone as quietly as she'd arrived. Kevin checked the monitor, noted something, said something about the night shift doing rounds, and followed her out. The room was quiet again. Laura was looking at the detective's card on the table. Her profile in the thin window light, the bandage at her wrist, the small cut near her temple. She looked tired in a way that had real layers. Not just the absence of sleep, but the weight of a night that had been a great deal before the crash and had then become considerably more. Ryan looked at her, all the things he didn't remember clearly. The phone call, the drive, the exact route he'd taken, the last clear view of the road before whatever happened on it. All of it was still gauze. Still shapes without clean edges. But this part, right here. Her in that chair, the card on the table, rain on the window. This part he was going to remember with complete clarity. Come here, he said. Ryan? Laura? He said it the way he'd learned to say it in the early years, when saying her name was something he treated with the same care he gave a first cut in good wood. Like the first cut mattered. Like it determined what the whole thing would become. She stood, moved to the side of the bed, careful of the wires. She sat on the very edge of the mattress, one hand on the rail, close enough that he could smell hospital antiseptic underneath something else. The faint, familiar residue of citrus soap she'd used every day for as long as he'd known her. I'm not sorry he knows about me, Ryan said. I'm sorry he scared you. I'm sorry he made you feel like you caused something you didn't cause. But I am not sorry you said my name. Her eyes went bright. She looked at the ceiling briefly, the way people do when they're deciding whether or not to let something happen to their face in front of someone else. You don't have to be brave right now, he said. I'm fine. You've been fine for about 3 hours straight, and it looks genuinely exhausting. She looked back at him. One breath, another, and then something in her face released. Not collapsed, not broken, just released, the way a held note releases when the player finally exhales. I was scared before the crash, she said. Her voice was quiet and direct. When we were in the truck, I kept checking the mirrors. Why? Because when I left the clinic last week, after I told him there was nothing to talk about, she stopped. I thought I saw his car behind mine on the highway home. I couldn't be sure. It was dark. I told myself I was being paranoid. She looked at her hands. Tonight I got in your truck, and I checked the mirrors 3 times before we got to the end of your street, and I didn't say anything about it. Because I didn't want to be the person who brought Brandon Ashby to your one chance at a second date. Ryan was quiet for a moment. You should have told me, he said, not accusation. Fact, I know. We would have taken a different route. I know, Ryan. You were managing it alone. She let out a breath somewhere between a laugh and something raw. I have a deeply established habit of managing things alone. She looked at him. You're familiar with the problem, and there it was. The thing that had always existed between them, the mirror that went both ways. She'd spent years watching him fail to ask for help, fail to name what he needed, fail to bring her into the parts of himself that were uncertain or afraid, and she'd done exactly the same thing with something completely different, and gotten in his truck and not said a word. Because that's what people do when they've learned, from the person they love, that the way to handle hard things is quietly and alone. We're both terrible, he said deeply. She almost smiled. But I'm significantly more self-aware about it. That seems arguable. Ryan, that seems completely arguable. This time the almost smile became a real one, brief, but real. And something in his chest did what it had been doing all night. The thing the monitor kept noticing. The thing he had exactly no control over. The thing he had spent 23 months pretending he'd figured out how to live without. He was still in a hospital bed. He had cracked ribs and a braced left knee and a concussion. And somewhere out there, a detective was reviewing traffic camera footage. The night was not finished. The morning was going to ask things of both of them. But Laura Callahan was sitting on the edge of his bed with her hand near his, and the room smelled like rain coming through a window somewhere in the building, and she'd said his name to a man she was walking away from. He turned his palm up on the blanket again. She looked at it, then at him, then back at it, then she placed her hand in his. And the monitor beside him did exactly what Sandra Callahan might have predicted, and absolutely nothing about Ryan's expression suggested he had any objection to that. The night in a hospital doesn't get dark the way night gets dark anywhere else. It dims, it slows. The corridor traffic thins from a constant stream to occasional footsteps, single sets, purposeful, going somewhere specific. The overhead lights in the hallway shift to something lower and yellower, institutional amber, the color of a city seen from altitude. The machines don't quiet. They never quiet. They become the baseline, the rhythm everything else arranges itself around, the way a river becomes silence to people who live beside it long enough. Ryan didn't sleep. Not because of the pain, though the pain had opinions. Not because of the monitor, though the monitor was committed to its job. He didn't sleep because Laura was in the chair next to his bed with her laptop open on her knees, and a case file spread across the armrest and her reading glasses on. Small wire-framed ones she hadn't mentioned and didn't seem self-conscious about, which meant she'd had them long enough that they were just part of her now, part of who she'd become in the years they'd been apart. And she was working, annotating something, making small precise marks in the margins, her mouth moving slightly, when a sentence required full concentration. He looked at the ceiling instead of at her for a while. Looked at the humming light fixture and thought about the 23 months, and what they had and hadn't contained, and thought about the phone call he couldn't remember in detail, but apparently had delivered with enough clarity to constitute the best thing he'd said in years. He thought about even the version of himself he didn't remember doing better than the version he'd been. That was uncomfortable. It was also useful. Both of those things at once, he was learning, was how most of the important information arrived. Around midnight, Sandra came back. She appeared in the doorway with fresh coffee. Real coffee this time, from the machine near the family waiting area that dispensed something approximately 3 levels above the paper cup situation. And she stood there for a moment taking in the scene. Laura in the chair with the laptop. Ryan awake, the two of them in the proximity of people who have recently said difficult things to each other and are now existing in the aftermath of having said them. Sandra's face did the thing it did. Open and helpless and completely transparent. Her eyes went immediately wet. Laura didn't look up from her document. Mom, I can hear you from here. I'm not doing anything. Sandra set the coffee down on the tray table. I'm delivering beverages. Quietly and without comment. You're crying. I'm not crying. A pause. My eyes are doing something adjacent to crying. That's different, Ryan said. Sandra, that's just crying. Sandra pressed her lips together, looked at the ceiling and breathed through her nose. You too. She shook her head with the expression of someone who has been waiting a very long time to shake her head exactly like this. You two deserve each other. I mean that as a compliment. I'm going to sit in the hallway. She was gone before Laura could formulate a response. Laura looked at the empty doorway, then at Ryan. Her expression was layered, embarrassed and fond, and something underneath both that she wasn't quite ready to name out loud. She's been waiting 2 years for this, Ryan said. She has not. She mentioned you every time I ran into her. Laura set her reading glasses on top of the laptop. You ran into my mother. Millhaven has one good hardware store and one good diner and a Walmart. It's statistically inevitable, and she mentioned me. She asked how the shop was doing, then how I was doing. Then she said she'd had lunch with you and you seemed happy, but she wasn't sure about the new. He stopped. Laura's expression had gone careful. The new what? The new person. She was quiet for a moment. Then, she told you about Brandon. She told me you were seeing someone. Not details, just that you were. And that she wasn't sure how she felt about it. Sandra is constitutionally incapable of poker, I know. I've always found it comforting. Laura took her glasses off the laptop and folded them. Set them on the tray table, aligning them with the edge out of pure automatic habit. He'd forgotten about that. The way she organized small objects near her when she was thinking. Aligning things to surfaces, as if order in small things helped with order in large ones. Brandon Ashby. She said, like she was picking up a thread she'd set down earlier and checking its condition. I want to tell you more about that. Not because I think you're owed details, but because I think the full picture matters for tonight. Okay, she took a breath. I met him 14 months after we ended. I was in Nashville. I had the job. I'd built a life there, a good one, a real one, people I liked, work I cared about. I was fine. She paused on the word in a way that suggested she'd examined it carefully at the time and found it both true and not the whole truth. He was my building. Different floor, different company. We kept seeing each other in the elevator for a month before either of us said anything beyond the weather. What changed? He held the elevator door for me when I was running late with both hands full of files and a coffee I was about to drop, and he didn't make it into a moment. He just held the door and went back to looking at his phone. She looked at some private memory of it. It seemed like such a small thing. But I was very tired at the time of men who made ordinary helpfulness into a transaction. Ryan absorbed that without comment, because the comment it deserved was about him, and this was not the moment for that particular detour. He was organized, she continued. Calm. Had his life arranged in ways that seemed genuinely settled rather than performed. He knew what he wanted, or he presented as someone who did, which I understand now is not always the same thing. She looked at her hands. After 2 years of not knowing what I was to someone, knowing felt like oxygen. That makes sense. It does. And it was also, she searched. It was the wrong oxygen for the wrong atmosphere. I just didn't know that yet. When did you know? She was quiet for a long beat. Outside, a cart rattled down the hallway. Someone's shoes, gone. He proposed at a dinner with 12 members of his family. Her voice was flat and dry on it. His mother was there, 3 of his brothers, an aunt from Ohio. A violinist appeared at the table. I have never successfully established who arranged the violinist. And he got down on one knee and everyone was watching and I said yes. Ryan looked at her. I said yes, she repeated, because I was surrounded by 12 people who wanted me to say yes, and there was a violinist, and I didn't know how to say no to that kind of momentum. And then for 3 weeks I wore the ring and waited to feel right about it. And it never did. It felt like wearing someone else's coat. Warm enough, technically sufficient, completely wrong, so you gave it back. I gave it back. She let out a slow breath. He took it badly. Not immediately. He had this initial phase of calm, where I thought maybe we'd get through it like 2 adults. And then the calm ended and something else started. What kind of something else? Cycling. Apologies that became accusations in the middle of the sentence. Accusations that circled back to apologies. He called me at work. He texted from blocked numbers. He sent flowers to the clinic with notes that were either sweet or threatening depending on which sentence you focused on. And they were somehow always both. She looked at her folded hands. I kept telling myself he was hurting and people do irrational things when they're hurting and if I was patient it would pass. How long did you wait? Too long, she said it plainly. Without self-punishment, just acknowledgement. I blocked his number a month ago. I thought that was the end of it. Ryan's chest was very still and his jaw was doing something he was consciously managing. Because the story Laura was telling was a cold, grinding kind of enraging, the kind that settled in the back of a person's throat and stayed there. Brandon Ashby was a man Ryan had never met and already understood with a clarity that was entirely unwelcome. He came back, Ryan said. After you blocked him, he came to the clinic. He said he just wanted to talk. That he'd been doing a lot of thinking. That he understood now. Her mouth tightened. That's always how it started. The understanding. The new version of himself that was going to be different this time, and you said my name, and I said your name. She looked at him directly. I told him there was no door open, that I was done with the conversation, that there were people in my life who knew how to be present for me without needing to own me. She stopped. He asked who, and I said yours, because I'm the counterexample. The expression that crossed her face was complicated and honest and not entirely comfortable for either of them. Because you were the one I was thinking about when I was trying to explain what I actually wanted. Which I didn't fully realize until after I'd already said your name, outside the window. October in Tennessee had a particular quality at night. The temperature dropped fast, the fields around town exhaled something loamy and cold, and the rain didn't fall so much as accumulate, quiet and incremental. He knows your address, Ryan said. The shop? I think so. He asked, once early on, what my ex did. I said you were a furniture maker. I probably mentioned Elm Street at some point. He pays attention to information the way people do when they're cataloging rather than just listening, and tonight he followed us. She was quiet, Laura. I don't know that with certainty. She said it carefully, like she was still allowing herself the technical uncertainty even though the rest of her had already arrived at the conclusion. I suspected. When we got to Mill Road, there were headlights behind us that had been there for a while, and She stopped. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid. You weren't paranoid. I know that now. You knew it then. She looked at him with the expression of someone who doesn't want to concede a point but is too honest not to. Yes. Some part of me knew then, and I didn't say anything because I didn't want to be the woman who gets in someone's truck on a second chance and immediately introduces her ex-boyfriend's damage into the situation. I would rather have known, I know. We could have. I know, Ryan. Her voice was soft but not soft enough to be gentle. It was the voice she used when she needed him to hear her rather than just receive the words. I understand the alternative outcomes. I've been running them since the ambulance. I know what I should have said and when I should have said it. I'm aware, she looked at him. I'm also not going to spend tonight telling myself I caused this, because I didn't cause this. He did, you're right, I know I'm right. I just needed to say it out loud. The machine marked his heartbeat with its customary indifference. He looked at her and thought, there she is. The version of Laura who could hold complexity without collapsing it into simplicity, who could name her own failure and Brandon's in the same breath without redistributing the weight incorrectly, who had always been, underneath the warm and the funny and the bare feet on his couch, fundamentally accurate about things in a way that he had found both magnetic and occasionally confronting. What do you need right now? He said. She thought about it. Actually thought, rather than reflexively answering. I need to call Detective Carver. I need to tell her about the clinic visit last week in more detail than I gave her earlier. I should have done that the first time she was here, but I was. She stopped. I was trying to keep it manageable. Call her. And then, she continued, I need you to tell me something ordinary, something from your regular life. Something that has nothing to do with any of this. He understood immediately. I have a commission I'm about 3 weeks from finishing. A woman in Brentwood who has changed her mind about the drawer pulls 4 times. Laura looked at him. 4, she started with brushed nickel, moved to oil-rubbed bronze, briefly considered matte black. Now she wants something called antique brass, which I have explained is different from regular brass in ways that are largely philosophical. And you're still doing it. She's a paying customer and she's very enthusiastic about the process. You love that she's enthusiastic about the process. He didn't deny it. Something in Laura's expression shifted. Not the almost smile. Something quieter and more settled. The look of someone who has remembered, with sudden clarity, a thing they'd thought they'd made peace with losing. She stood. Kept hold of his hand. I'm going to call Detective Carver from the hallway. My mother is out there. Kevin is somewhere with the overnight team. She looked at him. I'll be back, I know. She squeezed his hand and let go. At the door she stopped. Not dramatically. Just stopped, like something needed to be said from that position, from the threshold, from the place where you were neither fully in nor fully out, Ryan. She turned back. You said you loved me and you didn't want anything from me in return. Just needed me to have heard it." She met his eyes. "I heard it, and for the record," her voice was even and clear and completely without performance. "I am not saying it back because I almost died, either." She was gone into the corridor before he could respond. He lay back in the bed. The monitor noted his heart rate with its usual editorial neutrality. The rain on the glass had softened to something barely above mist. His ribs ached, his knee ached. His head had graduated from pounding to a duller, more persistent pressure, the kind that suggests it's settling in for the duration. He thought about what he'd just said to her, and the fact that he'd said it. Not the fact of the feeling. He'd known the feeling for a long time. The fact of the sentence. 4 years together and 23 months apart. And it had taken a hospital bed and cracked ribs and a concussion to produce the actual words in sequence. He thought, "The version of me I don't remember tonight did better than the one I was being." That was uncomfortable. It was also, he understood, the beginning of something more useful than comfort. 20 minutes later, Laura came back. She wasn't alone. Sandra came in behind her, and behind Sandra came a uniformed officer, young, serious-faced, broad-shouldered, who positioned himself just outside the door without being asked. The door stood open. The officer was visible from the bed. Visible and clearly intentional. "Carver is sending someone to Brandon's address tonight," Laura said. She sat back in the chair, back straight. The laptop was closed and set aside. She wasn't going to work anymore tonight. "She wants a full recorded statement from me in the morning," she said. She paused. She said, "Based on what I described about the clinic visit and the prior contact, this has enough of a pattern to open a formal investigation independent of the accident." Sandra sat in the second chair, quietly, which for Sandra required visible effort. Ryan looked at Laura. She was looking at the officer visible in the doorway. "He's not going to win this room," Ryan said. She looked back at him. No, her voice was steady and something beneath steady that was harder to name. Not peace, not yet, but the early pressure of something moving toward it. "He isn't." Sandra reached over and put her hand over Laura's on the armrest. Laura looked at it, let it stay. The three of them settled into the kind of quiet that wasn't empty, the kind that held things, kept things, understood that the night had been a great deal, and that more of it remained, and that sometimes what you did with that knowledge was simply stay where you were. The officer outside the door checked his watch and didn't move. Ryan looked at the ceiling, at the humming light, at the room that smelled like antiseptic, and the bran muffin still sitting on the tray table, which Laura had brought, and not taken back, and which remained on the table not because she'd forgotten it. He understood, but because some part of her had decided it belonged here for now. "Laura," he said. She looked up. "Is the muffin still available, or has it been reclassified as a structural element of the room?" Sandra made the sound that was not a cough. Laura's chin dropped. She pressed her lips together, failed to prevent something from happening to her face that was unmistakably the expression of someone trying not to laugh in a hospital room at midnight and losing badly. "You are concussed," she said. "You keep saying that like it explains the jokes. The jokes predate the concussion. The jokes are worse post-concussion. The jokes are identical. You're just in a more vulnerable state, Ryan." "Laura," she laughed. A real one. Small and genuine, lasting only a few seconds, and it broke through the end of a night that had been trying very hard to stay serious. Sandra's eyes filled again, predictably and completely, and she looked at the ceiling and did not say a single word, which was perhaps the greatest demonstration of restraint Ryan had ever witnessed from her. The laugh faded, but the room was different after it. Something had shifted in the air. Not resolved, not fixed. Nothing had been fixed by a joke about a muffin at midnight, but redistributed, made survivable, which was, Ryan understood, looking at Laura Callahan in borrowed scrubs in a plastic chair in the yellow amber October dark, looking at Sandra Callahan not crying, looking at the officer in the doorway, looking at the window where the rain had finally eased to something barely audible, which was sometimes all a night needed to be. Not fixed, survivable, with someone beside you. And the muffin, technically, still available. Morning in a hospital arrived not with a single event but with accumulation. The cleaning cart first. Wheels on linoleum, the rhythm of institutional efficiency that began at 6 and worked its way down the corridor like a tide coming in. Then the shift change. Voices at the nurse's station. The handoff of information. The compressed shorthand of people describing human conditions in the language of people who did it every day. Then light. The window going from black to gray to the pale, undecided color of an October morning that hadn't yet committed to being anything. Ryan had slept eventually, not much. Maybe 2 hours, maybe 3. The kind of sleep that isn't restful so much as necessary, the body insisting on its minimum requirements, regardless of what the mind had opinions about. He'd woken once when Laura shifted in the chair, pulling the thin hospital blanket someone had brought her up around her shoulders, and he'd stayed very still because he didn't want to disturb whatever small comfort she'd managed to find in a plastic chair at 3 in the morning. He'd thought, watching her sleep, "This is the most ordinary thing in the world." Someone else in the same room. It shouldn't feel like anything particular. It felt like everything. He hadn't examined that. He'd let it exist without dissecting it, which was new behavior for him. The instinct had always been to turn a thing over until he understood its mechanism, until the feeling became a system he could manage, rather than something he simply had to be inside of. Laura had called that instinct out once. Years ago, when they were still together. You treat your own emotions like they're a problem you can solve if you just find the right approach. He'd argued with her at the time. He'd been wrong. The officer outside the door had changed shifts at some point in the night. A different face, same posture, same quiet authority in the doorway. Sandra had gone home around 2, with the reluctance of a woman who understood she was needed elsewhere and deeply preferred not to go. She'd touched Laura's shoulder on the way out, squeezed once, and Laura had reached up and pressed Sandra's hand for a moment without opening her eyes. Ryan had watched that and thought, 4 years I was part of this family, and I let it go too. Detective Margaret Carver arrived at 7:45 with coffee. Real coffee. 3 cups. 1 for Ryan, 1 for herself. 1 placed near Laura for when she woke. The 3rd cup was either consideration or experience, and Carver, Ryan suspected, didn't do things out of consideration that she hadn't already filed under experience. She set Ryan's on the tray table and sat in Sandra's vacated chair with the ease of someone who had conducted interviews in stranger rooms than this. She didn't open her notebook immediately. She looked at Ryan with the direct, unornamented attention of someone about to say something factual she'd already verified. Brandon Ashby was located at 11:23 last night, she said, 3 blocks from this hospital. Sitting in his vehicle in a loading zone with his engine off, Ryan's jaw moved once. He had written your room number on the back of a receipt, Carver continued. Someone at the front desk confirmed it before the supervisor caught the call and flagged it. We're addressing that internally. She paused. He was interviewed at the station. He denied being on Mill Road last night and the paint transfer on his bumper, Ryan said. He says he had a parking lot incident 2 weeks ago. Her expression said nothing about that claim. Nothing at all, which said plenty. The paint transfer analysis will take a few days. But we also have camera footage from 2 intersections on Mill Road. And from the light at Elm and 5th near your shop. She opened her notebook to a marked page. His vehicle followed yours from the moment you left the parking lot on Elm Street. He was behind you for approximately 14 minutes before the incident on Mill Road, 14 minutes. Ryan held that number and did not say what he was thinking, which involved Brandon Ashby and consequences in terms that weren't appropriate for a medical setting. He said nothing because Laura had just woken up. She came awake the way she always had. Not gradually, not with the slow assembly of consciousness, but with the clean switch alertness of someone whose mind picked up exactly where it left off. She blinked once. Registered Carver, registered the coffee, reached for it with her bandaged wrist, and switched hands when it pulled. 14 minutes, she said. She'd been awake long enough to hear. From Elm Street, from the parking lot, Carver confirmed. He parked on the street when you went inside. He waited approximately 22 minutes before you came back out, which meant he'd been outside the shop before they'd left. Had driven there deliberately, had sat in his SUV on a dark October street in the rain and waited for them to walk out into it. Laura held the coffee cup in both hands. Her face was doing the flat, controlled thing that Ryan had come to understand was not the absence of feeling. It was feeling managed with precision, the way a load-bearing beam manages weight, by staying completely still while holding something significant. What happens now, she said. He's been charged with reckless driving causing bodily harm. Given the footage and the paint transfer pending analysis, the DA's office is also reviewing stalking charges under Tennessee statute. Carver looked at her directly. The prior contact, the clinic visit, the messages, the flowers, all of that becomes relevant and documentable. I need your full account today if you're physically able. I'm able. We also recommend a protective order. The paperwork can be started today. Okay, clean. No deliberation. Okay. Ryan watched her absorb it. not with the watchfulness of someone assessing damage, but with the attention of someone who understood that this moment, this morning after clarity, was doing something to Laura's face she might not fully see from the inside. She looked like someone who had been bracing against something for a very long time and had just realized that thing was now being handled by people whose job it was to handle it. Not gone, not resolved, but moved, shifted from the interior space where she'd been carrying it alone for months into the correct systems where it had always belonged. He's in custody currently, Carver said. He'll be arraigned this afternoon. With the charge and his documented history of contact, the judge will likely set conditions that keep him away from both of you. Likely. That single word did its small work in the room. Ryan noted it. Laura noted it. Neither of them pressed it, because both understood that likely was honest, and anything stronger would have been kindness dressed as accuracy. I'll send Officer Diaz back up while I process some paperwork, Carver said. She stood. Looked at Ryan. How's the head? Cooperating? Your doctor wants another scan this morning before discharge. She looked at Laura. I'll be back in 45 minutes for your statement. She took her coffee and left. The room held the shape she'd left behind for a moment. Then Laura set her coffee down and pressed both palms flat against her thighs, the physical equivalent of recalibrating, of running a quick inventory on what was real and what was manageable. She did it and then sat up slightly straighter and looked at him. He was in the parking lot on Elm Street. She said, yes, while we were inside, yes. While I was sitting on your workbench talking about Nashville, she paused. While you were, she stopped. While I was making an extremely convincing case for myself, Ryan said, you were nervous. I was profoundly nervous. I knocked over a can of mineral spirits. You didn't mention that. It felt like incriminating evidence at the time. He paused. The bench is fine. The floor is fine. The mineral spirits were not a significant casualty. Laura looked at him with the expression she wore when something was simultaneously exasperating and warm, and she clearly wasn't trying to feel both at once, which meant it was real, which was the only kind that mattered. Ryan Mitchell, she said. There was a man sitting in an SUV in the rain outside your shop for 22 minutes, and you knocked over mineral spirits being nervous. I also rehearsed 3 different openings and used none of them. What were the openings? Option 1 was direct and dignified. Option 2 was self-deprecating, which I felt had a stronger track record with you historically. Option 3 was, he stopped. Option 3 was asking if you'd seen the prior commission and letting the table do some of the work. She stared at him. You were going to use furniture as an emotional proxy. The table is very good, Ryan. The table is excellent. It would have made a compelling argument. For what? That I understand how things are supposed to last. She went quiet. He hadn't meant it to land that way. Or maybe he had. He was still learning the difference between the things he said because they were useful and the things he said because they were true. And the overlap between those categories was larger than he'd previously mapped. I want to table. See the table, she said quietly, when you're ready to show me, not an acceptance, not a declaration, a careful, concrete expression of interest in a real thing. In Laura's vocabulary, which he was relearning the way you relearn a road you haven't driven in 2 years. The muscle memory returning before the landmarks do. That was meaningful. It'll be finished in about 3 weeks, he said. Then I'll come in 3 weeks. The door opened. Dr. Elena Marsh, Ryan's physician since admission, a direct woman in her 50s with the economy of language that comes from knowing exactly which information matters, came in with a clipboard and the expression of someone who had already reviewed the file and formed her conclusions before entering. She looked at the results from the overnight monitoring, asked Ryan a series of questions about visual disturbance and nausea and headache quality, listened to his answers, and told him she wanted one more imaging series before she would sign discharge paperwork. She also told Laura, with the matter-of-fact directness of someone used to speaking to people adjacent to the medical field, that her wrist needed re-evaluation before she drove herself anywhere, and that elevated stress markers noted by the overnight team warranted follow-up. Laura said, I'm aware. Dr. Marsh said, I know you're aware. I'm saying it so it's on record that someone said it out loud to you in a clinical context. Laura looked at her. Fair. Which was how Ryan understood that Laura had spoken to Dr. Marsh before he'd been conscious enough to meet her, and that their prior exchange had established its own particular register. Nicole arrived at 9. She appeared in the doorway, with a grocery bag from the Walgreens 2 blocks from the hospital, the practical care package of someone who had driven through the night and knew that what people needed after emergencies was not flowers but phone chargers and granola bars with enough protein to constitute a meal if you ate 2 of them. She had her mother's energy in her face. Ryan's mother's energy, specifically the barely leashed urgency that arrived wearing calm as a costume. She saw Laura. She stopped. She had the bag in one hand and her keys still in the other, and she stood in the doorway, looking at Ryan's hand near Laura's on the blanket. Not touching, just near, the way 2 things are near each other when they've been near each other long enough, and her eyes filled up with tears so fast it seemed involuntary. Like a tap being opened, Nicole, Ryan said. A warning. She pointed at him. You owe me $20. Laura's laugh came out fast and helpless. The kind of laugh that ambushes you before you can decide whether it's appropriate for the setting. Nicole set the grocery bag on the windowsill, pressed her lips together, visibly assembled herself. Then she crossed the room and hugged Laura first, before Ryan, which was a choice, Ryan noted, and understood rather than took personally. Laura hugged her back, solid and real, not the careful hug of people who haven't seen each other in a while, but the grip of 2 people who are both, in this specific moment, relieved. $20, Nicole said into Laura's shoulder. He told me, Laura said. Did he tell you I bet him in August? I told him in August he needed to call you. He did not tell me about August. August, Ryan. I told you in August, Ryan said. You told me to stop moping around the shop and do something useful with my feelings. That's not the same as actionable advice. It is the same. It absolutely is the same. Nicole pulled back from Laura and looked at her. At the cut near her temple, at the wrist. She absorbed the damage inventory, and her face moved through something private and sharp, and then settled. Are you okay? Getting there, Laura said. Nicole looked at her for another beat, satisfied herself with whatever she found, then turned to Ryan and hit him on the arm with enough force to communicate exactly how she felt about the last 12 hours, while being precisely careful about his left side. Ow, he said. That's for scaring me. She sat on the edge of the windowsill. Tell me everything, so they told her. Or Laura told her, mostly, with Ryan adding when the account required someone who'd been conscious for more of it. Nicole listened with the complete stillness of someone who only went still when information was serious enough to require it. She asked 2 questions during the whole account, one about the camera footage, one about the arraignment timeline, and when Laura finished, Nicole sat with her hands folded and her mouth pressed flat. Brandon Ashby. She said, yes, Laura said. He's in custody since last night. Nicole nodded. Then she looked at Ryan. Were you scared? Ryan considered it honestly. I was angry first. The scared part came after. That's very you. I'm aware. The scared part came while I was on painkillers, he said, which was probably the most useful scheduling available, Nicole said. And now I'm waiting for a scan and then discharge and 6 weeks of not operating power tools. He paused. Which is my entire job. Nicole looked at Laura. Laura looked at Ryan. A triangle of mutual acknowledgement. The prior commission, Ryan said, mostly to himself. Is there someone who can finish it? Laura asked. My guy Danny can do the final surface work. He knows the piece, Ryan shifted carefully. Margaret Pryor will probably change her mind about the drawer pulls one more time while I'm recovering. I'll address it from the couch. Via strongly worded text, Nicole said. Via very professional correspondence. He texts in complete sentences when he's annoyed, Nicole told Laura. Full paragraphs. Proper punctuation. It's genuinely unsettling, Laura said. I know. And the 2 small words carried something in them. The weight of accumulated knowledge about a particular person, the kind of knowing that takes years to build and doesn't transfer. And Ryan heard it and something in his chest rearranged itself in response. Not dramatically, just settled. He thought, I forgot that she already knows me. Not the version I present. The whole version, including the punctuation when I'm annoyed. He thought, I spent 23 months forgetting she already knew. The scan happened at 10. A technician came with a wheelchair, which Ryan accepted with the resigned dignity of a man who had decided that arguing about wheelchairs in a hospital was a losing position on every level. Laura walked beside the chair. Nicole followed with the Walgreens bag, already eating one of the granola bars she'd brought, reading the label with the expression of someone who had opinions about protein sources. The corridor was different in daylight, longer, more populated, boozier, louder, more visibly human in its complexity. People moving with purpose in both directions. A family speaking quietly outside a room 3 doors down. A man in scrubs eating a sandwich standing up because sitting was simply not an option right now. Laura walked beside the wheelchair and didn't say much. She didn't need to. She was there, which was the relevant fact, and Ryan had spent enough time in the absence of that fact to understand its value without requiring it to announce itself. The scan took 20 minutes. Ryan lay in the machine and listened to its sounds and thought, with the deliberate focus of a man who had been told to stay very still, about the shop, about Danny finishing the surface work on the prior commission, about the grain pattern on the tabletop, which was exceptional. One of those pieces of wood that carried a story in it, visible only when you prepared the surface correctly, when you removed everything that was getting in the way of what was already there. About the fact that the table would probably outlive him, would outlive Margaret Pryor and her 32-year marriage, would exist in a house somewhere for another 50 years, holding meals and conversations, and the ordinary accumulation of a life being lived. That seemed right. That seemed like the point of making things well. He came back to the room, and Dr. Marsh came in 20 minutes later with the second scan results. They were consistent with the first. She was comfortable signing discharge paperwork with conditions: rest, limited mobility, no power tools for 6 weeks, a follow-up with his own physician in 5 days, a neurology consult if any of the listed symptoms occurred. She handed him a printed sheet. She looked at Laura and said, "Make sure he reads it." Laura said, "He will read it." Ryan said, "I am a literate adult." Both women looked at him with the synchronized, serene skepticism of people who have arrived at the same conclusion independently and are entirely at peace with it. The discharge paperwork took another 40 minutes. Insurance verification, medication instructions, the nurse going over the printed sheet, as though he hadn't been given the printed sheet, the pharmacy order for the anti-inflammatory and the muscle relaxant that he was not. Dr. Marsh had been unambiguous: to take and then attempt to operate anything. Kevin Webb came by at the end of the shift to say goodbye, which he did with the genuine warmth of someone who had witnessed something meaningful over the past hours and felt it. "Good luck," Kevin said, and it wasn't the pro forma version. "Thank you," Ryan said, and it wasn't either. Meanwhile, Detective Carver had come and gone again. She'd taken Laura's full statement in a small family room down the hall. 45 minutes, recorded, thorough. Laura came back from it with the particular expression of someone who has just organized something messy and painful into a structure that can be handled by the right systems. Not lighter, exactly. "Cleaner? She's good at her job," Laura said when she came back. "What did she say?" "She said the prior contact, all 6 months of it, documents a pattern that strengthens the stalking charge considerably. The clinic visit last week, the blocked number calls, the flowers, the colleague contacts." She paused. "Apparently he'd been calling people I work with, asking about my schedule. She'd already pulled some of that before this morning. He was thorough, he was. In all the wrong ways." She sat down. She also said, another pause, "This one with a different texture." She said the women who end up most hurt in situations like this are the ones who decided it wasn't bad enough yet to involve other people. And that deciding it wasn't bad enough yet is exactly what he needed me to keep deciding. Ryan was quiet for a moment. "Are you okay?" She considered the word honestly. "I'm clearer than I was yesterday. That's what I have right now. That's enough." "Yes," she said. "It is." Nicole brought the car around. A practical choice. Her sedan was more accessible than any alternative, and Ryan's truck was a different kind of story, involving an impound lot and an insurance claim he was not, today, going to think about in any detail. The hospital exit felt larger than doorways usually do, not because anything about the door was physically notable. Because the inside of the hospital and the outside of the hospital were two different states of being, and crossing between them was the moment where the night officially became the past and the next thing officially became the present. Cold air. October, Tennessee. Sharp and clean after rain, the way the air always was the morning after, like the atmosphere had been laundered. The trees along the hospital's perimeter had turned, or had been turning for days, and Ryan was only seeing it now, gold and rust and amber in the early afternoon light. Laura was beside him, not holding his arm, not hovering. Walking beside him at the pace of someone who had decided to be where she was without making a production of it. He looked at the trees. "I used to drive this road in October just to see the color," he said. She looked where he was looking. "Before they built the new wing, you could see the ridge from the east parking lot. Did you know that? From working here?" "From visiting you once." She kept her eyes on the trees. "You'd cut your hand on a table saw. You said it was minor. 8 stitches, minor stitches." She looked at him sideways. "You drove yourself to the ER. I'm capable of, Ryan. You called it a scratch. To my face." While the triage nurse was making an expression that suggested the word scratch, was not the word she would have chosen. He remembered that. 3 years ago, Laura had shown up 40 minutes after he'd mentioned it casually on the phone, which had apparently not been as casual as he'd intended, and had sat through the stitching with the focused calm of someone who spent her professional days with children in pain and knew how to hold still around someone else's. "You brought me a sandwich," he said. "You hadn't eaten since breakfast. Egg salad. You hate egg salad. It was the only thing left in the vending area." He glanced at her. "I ate the whole thing," you said, and I quote, "This is genuinely terrible, thank you." He thought about that. About remembering a sentence someone said about an egg salad sandwich 3 years ago in a hospital parking lot. About what that kind of retention said if you were willing to look at it honestly. Which she was. Which was one of the many things about Laura Callahan that he had, over the last 23 months, done a very poor job of adequately accounting for. Nicole pulled the car around and they drove back to Birch Street in the kind of quiet that wasn't waiting for something, just existing. Nicole put on a station that played old Americana, the real kind with fiddles and actual stories in it, and let the 30-minute drive do what drives do, which is give people time to transition between versions of themselves. Ryan's house on Birch Street looked, in the October afternoon light, exactly as it always looked, and also somehow different. The way things look when you've been away long enough that the ordinary has refreshed into something you have to actually see rather than simply recognize. The white paint slightly weathered at the corners, the porch with its red oak boards except for the third step from the bottom, which he'd been meaning to address for long enough that it had graduated from a to-do item into a feature of the landscape. Laura looked at the third step when she got out of the car. She looked at it with the expression of someone reuniting with a known quantity. "Still," she said, "I'll fix it this week. You have cracked ribs, I have tools, and a certain amount of stubbornness that the ribs haven't reached yet. Ryan, Laura, you are not fixing a porch step with cracked ribs. The step is a hazard. I know the step is a hazard. I have known the step is a hazard since 2021. Your institutional memory on this subject is genuinely impressive. I tripped on it twice, I know. I felt bad both times, and then didn't fix it. And then didn't fix it, he confirmed. Which is consistent with a pattern we have now identified and are actively working to address." She looked at him with the expression that was a direct line between exasperated and fond, and had always been shorter than either of them anticipated. Nicole said, from behind them, "I'm going to put his bag inside and pretend I can't hear any of this from the porch." She went up the steps, navigating the third one with the careful precision of someone who'd been briefed, and through the door Laura stood on the bottom step. Ryan stood on the path. The distance between them was 3 feet, and also the accumulated weight of everything said and unsaid in the last 14 hours, which was a different kind of distance entirely, and one that 3 feet of October air did not fully account for. "You should come in," he said. "I should go home, change, sleep in an actual bed for a few hours. You should do all of those things." She looked at him. But nothing. Go home, sleep. Come back when you want to, when I want to, not when you think you should. When you actually want to." She stood there for a moment, looking at him the way she looked at things she was deciding about. Not uncertain, because Laura was rarely uncertain, but deliberate. Making choices deliberately, which was its own kind of careful. "Thursday," she said. "Thursday, I have a late session at the clinic. After 6, I'll be here. You'll be on the couch with the anti-inflammatory and the printed sheet." "I'll be on the couch with the anti-inflammatory and the printed sheet." "Yes, and we'll..." She stopped. "What will we do?" He thought about it for a real moment. Not what he was supposed to say. What he actually wanted. "I'll tell you about the clients I have backed up. You'll tell me about your cases, the ones you can tell. We'll figure out dinner from somewhere that isn't a hospital. I'll show you the photos of the prior commission on my phone." He paused. "Ordinary things." She was quiet for a beat. Then she looked at him with something that was neither the almost smile nor the full one. Something in between those two that he didn't have a name for yet but recognized as real. "Ordinary things," she said. "Yes." She breathed in the cold October air, let it out slowly, looked at the porch, the house, the trees at the edge of the property that had gone the same gold rust as the ones outside the hospital. Then she looked at him. "Thursday," she said again. Different weight this time. A confirmation that was also a promise, and also, underneath both of those, a choice. She got in Nicole's car, which Nicole had brought back around from wherever she'd parked it, which suggested Nicole had excellent instincts about when to appear and when to give people 30 seconds on a front path, and they drove away. Ryan stood on the path and watched the car go. Then he went inside. The house was exactly as he'd left it, which was the unremarkable truth of all absences. The ordinary world continues without you, and is simply there when you return, requiring no explanation of itself. The mug with the chip at the rim, on the counter, the record collection against the living room wall, the coat rack by the door with 3 jackets, only 2 of which he currently wore. Kitchen. Not the prior commission, nothing elaborate. Just the piece of reclaimed oak he'd made for himself years ago, when he first moved in and needed something to eat at. The grain was simple. He'd been less skilled then. But it was solid. It had held. Nicole came out of the hallway where she'd put his bag. She looked at him standing in his own kitchen and didn't say anything for a moment. Thursday, he told her. She pressed her lips together and nodded once with the restraint of someone who had 17 things to say, and was, with visible effort, choosing none of them. Do you need anything before I head back? She said instead. No, food in the fridge? Probably not. I'll order you something. She picked up her phone. Don't argue with me about this. I drove 4 hours. I'm not arguing. Good, she typed. Set the phone down. Looked at him. You doing okay? Not about the ribs. Not about the knee. Not about any of the physical inventory. He knew what she was asking. I think so, he said, which was honest, which was the accurate version rather than the reassuring one, and the distinction mattered. She nodded. Couch. Printed sheet. I'll wait for the food. He went to the couch. It occurred to him, sitting there with his left leg stretched out, and the afternoon light moving across the floor, at the angle particular to October in Tennessee, that this was the same couch he'd sat on 23 months of Tuesday nights. Same cushions, same view of the window, same angle of light on the same floor. He'd sat here and cooked too much and watched shows he half paid attention to and reached for his phone on some of those nights, and not reached for it on others. The difference between then and this moment was not the couch. It was Thursday, not the day specifically, the existence of it. The fact that Thursday was a fixed point in the near future with Laura's name on it, chosen deliberately, not the cautious half-commitment of someone keeping options available, but the decision of a person who had said a specific day out loud on a front path and meant it. He thought about what Dr. Jeffrey Grant would eventually say about that, which was premature since he hadn't met Dr. Jeffrey Grant yet. He would in 2 weeks, on a Tuesday. He'd sit in a chair in a small office near the university and say, I don't know where to start, and Jeffrey Grant would say, wherever you are is fine, and Ryan would sit with that for a moment, and then start talking about a walnut table and a woman who cried over it and a phone call he'd made, that he couldn't entirely remember. And it would be the beginning of a different kind of work than he was used to. Not the work of hands and grain and surface, the work of language. The labor of translating the private into the communicable, of saying the things he'd spent 32 years routing around. He would be bad at it initially. He would get less bad at it gradually. He would, on a Tuesday 7 weeks after starting, say something in Jeffrey's office that surprised him with its accuracy. Something he hadn't known he knew until he said it. And Jeffrey would sit forward slightly and say that again, slower, and Ryan would, and the thing would clarify in the repetition, and that would be the session something important shifted in the architecture of how he understood himself. But all of that was later. Much of the important work was later. That had always been the point he kept missing, and was now, at 32 with cracked ribs on a Tuesday afternoon in October, beginning to understand differently. Right now, the couch, the afternoon light, the food Nicole ordered arriving 40 minutes later, soup from the diner on Main Street that Ryan had been going to for 15 years, which Nicole had ordered without asking because she knew, and that was what sisters were for. He thought about Thursday and what Thursday would actually be. 2 people in a house talking about their ordinary lives, not fixing everything, just starting. He thought about what starting looked like from the inside. Not the dramatic version, not the version where things resolved cleanly into certainty, but the actual version, which was 2 people who had hurt each other in different ways, deciding to be in the same room and see what came next. He thought about the shop, about Danny finishing the prior commission surface this week without him, about whether Margaret would call one more time about the drawer pulls. She would on Wednesday afternoon, while Ryan was sitting with his leg elevated on a kitchen chair, and he would take the call and talk her through the antique brass one final time, and feel something quietly satisfied about the way she said, I just knew that was right, as though the decision had always been hers, which he would acknowledge to himself. It essentially had been. He'd been wrong about the brass. She'd been right. The job of the craftsman was sometimes to get out of the way of what the piece wanted to be. He thought about the third step on the porch, how it was going to remain on the list for approximately 6 more weeks, while his ribs finished doing what they needed to do. Because Laura was correct about the ribs, and then it was getting fixed on a Saturday with the radio on, and it was going to take 25 minutes and it was going to be done. And that was the end of the third step as a recurring item in his life. His mother had hugged Laura for 45 seconds in the hospital corridor before discharge. Ryan had timed it without intending to. 45 seconds was a long hug. It communicated things that didn't require words. His father had shaken Ryan's hand on the way out, the handshake that was his father's vocabulary for things he didn't have other words for, and said, "Don't do the stupid thing again." Ryan had said, "Define the stupid thing." His father had said, "You know what it is." He did. He wasn't going to. The soup arrived. He ate it on the couch with the printed sheet on the cushion next to him, which he had in fact read twice, because he was a literate adult, and because DeWinn's Dr. Marsh had been sufficiently clear about the anti-inflammatory schedule that ignoring it would have required more stubbornness than even he currently had access to. Nicole sat at the kitchen table eating a granola bar and doing something on her laptop and not talking, which was one of the better things about Nicole. She understood the difference between presence and noise. At some point in the early evening, after Nicole had driven back to Dayton, and the house had settled into its own quiet, Ryan sat in the October light that had gone from afternoon amber to the thin early dark of a fall evening, and thought about the 26 minutes. The phone call he couldn't remember making. The voicemail he apparently left that said the right things in the right order. The version of himself that had picked up the phone in his shop at 5:30 on an October evening and called the person he'd loved for 6 years, 4 together and 2 apart, and said, apparently, the things he'd known were true and hadn't been willing to say. He didn't feel proprietary about that version of himself. Didn't feel like he could claim credit for what that version had done, exactly, since he couldn't remember doing it. But he felt something about it. Something adjacent to gratitude. Like hearing that someone you love did something brave while you weren't watching, and being glad of it. The room got darker. He didn't turn a light on immediately. He sat with the dark coming in through the windows the way dark does in the fall, earlier than you expect, faster than summer, without the dramatic quality of a winter night, just the ordinary, reasonable dark of October, doing what it always did. Thursday, he thought. 6 days from now. He thought about what he was going to say when she knocked on the door. He thought about the fact that he probably wasn't going to plan it. He thought about how not planning it was probably, actually, the right instinct. That the version of him who planned everything, who pre-loaded conversations and rehearsed openings and then used none of them, was the version that had stood in his shop for 23 months not calling, and the version that had just picked up the phone without a plan and talked for 26 minutes was the version she'd said yes to. He could work with that. He reached over and turned the lamp on. The kitchen came into the circle of light. The table with its simple grain, the mug with the chip at the rim, the counter where 2 cups of coffee used to sit on Sunday mornings, when Sunday mornings had a particular shape and a particular person in them. The house was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than it had been for 23 months. Not the quiet of absence, of something missing, of space that was supposed to be occupied and wasn't. Just ordinary quiet. The quiet of a house that knows someone is coming back Thursday. He believed it completely and without reservation, which was new. The believing without reservation. He'd always been good at the almost believing, at the hoping with an exit strategy, at the wanting that kept one hand on the door in case it needed to close quickly. That had been, Jeffrey Grant would eventually point out in a Tuesday session, a survival mechanism that had long since outlived its usefulness. But tonight he just believed it. 6 days. The lamp made a warm circle in the kitchen. Outside, October dark doing what it did. Inside, the quiet of a house with Thursday in it, and a man who had finally learned, at some cost, which direction was forward. He turned off the lamp eventually and went to bed. He slept. Thursday came the way most things that matter come. Without fanfare, inside ordinary hours, Laura knocked at 6:43. Not because she'd been standing outside calculating the right moment, but because that was when her session finished, when she'd driven across town in the thin October dark, when she'd sat in her car in front of his house for approximately 4 minutes, not because she was uncertain, but because she wanted to arrive at the door, having already decided something, rather than deciding it on the threshold. Ryan heard the knock from the couch, where he'd been with his leg elevated, following the printed sheet's instructions, with a fidelity that would have surprised Dr. Marsh, and he got up too fast, and his left side reminded him immediately that getting up too fast was still a taxed proposition. He opened the door. She was standing on the porch in her work coat, a dark green wool that he hadn't seen before, with a paper bag in one hand and her keys still in the other. Her hair was down. She looked like someone who had just come from work, and had also, somewhere in the drive over, let some of the day's professional structure fall away. She looked at him, at the crutch he'd graduated to from the wheelchair, at his face, which was past the worst of the bruising and into the greenish-yellow phase that suggested healing was happening, if not yet complete. "You look better," she said. "I look terrible. You look better than you did." She held up the bag. "I brought actual food, from the Thai place on Commerce. You remembered I like the Thai place on Commerce. You ordered from there approximately every third Tuesday for 4 years. It's not a feat of memory." He stepped back from the door. She came in. She stood in his living room for a moment, the same living room she'd stood in many times before, in a different version of their lives, and he watched her take it in, not with nostalgia, with the particular attention of someone updating an internal record. Noting what was the same, noting what had changed, filing both. The record collection was still against the wall. The coat rack still had too many jackets. The kitchen table was still the reclaimed oak, grain simple, made when he was less skilled and still solid after years of use. The step, she said, 6 more weeks. The ribs have veto power. I told Nicole it would be closer to 8. You two are in communication about my construction timeline. She texted me Tuesday. Laura set the bag on the counter and began unpacking it, with the easy familiarity of someone who knew which cabinet held the bowls. She stopped when she realized what she'd done, opened the second cabinet on the left without thinking, the one where he'd always kept them, and looked at him. "Still the same cabinet," he said. She looked at it for a moment, then finished unpacking. They ate at the kitchen table. Not the reclaimed oak one he was sitting at every day, the same one, the same table, which was somehow both unremarkable and the most grounded thing Ryan had felt in a week. She told him about a new case she'd taken on, a 7-year-old referred by the school, selective mutism, which she described with the clinical precision she used when she was also moved by something and was being careful not to let the movement overrun the professionalism. He listened the way he'd learned to listen to her about work, not looking for a place to insert his own thoughts, just following the thread, letting it be what it was. He told her about the Pryor Commission, about Margaret Pryor calling Wednesday afternoon exactly as predicted, about the antique brass drawer pulls, about his own eventual admission that she'd been right about the brass from the beginning, and the way she'd received that admission with the warmth of someone who hadn't needed him to say it but appreciated it anyway. "She sounds like someone I'd like," Laura said. "She is someone you'd like. She cried over a table and changed the course of my life. You'd have a lot to talk about." Laura's mouth curved. Not the almost smile, the real one, the one that went all the way up and didn't perform anything. "Did you tell her that?" "I told her the table was exceptional and that she had excellent taste in drawer pulls. Some information is private, very professional, via very professional correspondence." She laughed, and the sound of it in his kitchen, in the lamplight, with the Thai food between them and the October dark outside the window, was the most ordinary thing in the world and also the thing he'd been most missing without fully letting himself name it. They washed the dishes together. Her on the left, him on the right, which had always been how they did it, because she was left-handed, and he was not, and they'd worked it out in the first month, and never renegotiated. His ribs complained about the reaching, and he didn't mention it, and she noticed anyway, and took over the upper cabinet without comment. When the dishes were done, she leaned against the counter and looked at him. "How's your head?" she said. "Better. Not finished being better, but better. Sleeping? More than in the hospital. Less than ideal. That's normal for concussion recovery. It takes longer than people expect. Dr. Marsh said 3 to 4 weeks before I'm fully back. Dr. Marsh is probably being optimistic." She paused. "Have you had any of the follow-up symptoms? The light sensitivity, the Laura?" She stopped. "I'm not one of your cases," he said, not unkindly, just clearly. She looked at him for a moment. Something shifted in her expression, the professional register falling back, something more unguarded taking its place. "Old habit," she said. "I ask about people's symptoms when I don't know what else to ask. You can ask me what you actually want to ask. A beat. Are you okay?" Not medically, just, are you okay? He thought about it honestly. I think so. He stopped. Found the right words instead of the easy ones. I'm clearer than I was a week ago, about what I want and what I've been doing wrong, and what I'm willing to do about both of those things. The ribs are inconvenient. The rest of it feels like it's moving in the right direction. She was quiet for a moment. I started with the DV specialist Carver referred me to, she said. Second session was yesterday. How is it? Hard. Useful. She looked at her hands. She said something in the first session that I've been thinking about since. She said people who are used to managing difficult things alone don't stop doing it, just because the difficult thing is over. The habit runs deeper than the situation. She looked up. She was talking about me and Brandon, but it applies more broadly. It does, he said. I know it does. She met his eyes. I'm working on it. I want you to know that, not as a reassurance. Just as a fact. I know. He paused. I have my first Tuesday session next week. She raised her eyebrows. Jeffrey Grant? Nicole scheduled it. I've decided to let that be a kindness rather than an imposition. A real laugh this time, short and warm. That's growth. Apparently there's a lot of it happening. I'm trying not to strain anything. She pushed off the counter. She stood in his kitchen in the lamplight, in the dark green coat she hadn't taken off yet, and she looked at him the way she sometimes looked at things she was making a real decision about. I should go, she said. You need to rest. You could stay, he said. He said it plainly. Not as a loaded proposition, as a fact about what was available and what he wanted, which was the kind of statement he was practicing making. Just the true thing, offered without conditions. She looked at him for a long moment. Not tonight, she said, also plainly. Not because I don't want to, because I want to do this at the right speed, and tonight is our first Thursday and right speed matters to me. Okay, he said. She looked at him when he said it. Something in her expression registered the word. Its cleanness, its absence of argument. You're not going to push? I said I'd learn how to be different. This is part of that. She stepped toward the door. Then she stopped and turned back and kissed him. Not the careful, concussed, hospital version. This one had confidence in it. Her hand at his jaw. His hand finding the small of her back through the wool coat. Brief and present and real. She pulled back. Thursday, she said. Next week, I'll be here, he said. On the couch. Following the printed sheet, she smiled and went out the door, navigating the third step with the muscle memory of someone who had always known it was there. He stood in the open doorway and watched the taillights of her car disappear around the corner. Then he went back inside and sat at the kitchen table and put his hands flat on the grain of the old oak and felt the solid, held weight of it under his palms and thought, this is what starting looks like. Not a resolution, a direction. The weeks moved the way weeks do when something in your life has shifted. They had weight and texture instead of just duration. Thursday became a recurring fact. Not every Thursday, because neither of them was interested in a schedule that was really a test, in showing up out of obligation to a pattern rather than genuine want. But most Thursdays, and some Saturdays, and one Wednesday in November, when she texted in the afternoon and said she had a gap before her evening session, and did he want company, and he said yes, and she came over and they sat in the shop, while he talked Danny through the final adjustments on a cherry wood bookcase commission, and she graded program documentation at his old desk, and the radio played something quiet, and the late afternoon light came through the west window at the angle he'd always loved. She looked up at some point from her papers and caught him watching her. You're watching me work, she said. I'm watching the light, he said. You're watching me work and using the light as cover. He didn't deny it. She went back to her documentation with the expression of someone who had filed a thing away as settled. He went back to talking Danny through the bookcase. Later, after Danny left and the shop was quiet, she packed up her papers and they walked out together into the November evening. Cold had arrived properly now. Not the tentative chill of October, but the committed cold of the season turning, the kind that required a real coat and meant it. She had hers. He had his. The heavy canvas work jacket, the one she'd once said made him look like he was about to go build something important, which he'd considered one of the more useful compliments he'd received. She's going to love those shelves, Laura said, about the cherry wood bookcase. She's already changed her mind once about the shelf spacing. I expect one more before delivery. You expect it, and you're still doing it. She's building a reading room. She's been thinking about this room for 20 years. The least I can do is let the shelf spacing be right. Laura looked at him sideways. You like this part. I like when people know what they actually want and aren't afraid to say so. He paused. I'm working on applying that principle more broadly. She was quiet for a moment. Then she took his hand. Just took it. Without preamble, without discussion. The way you take something that's yours to take. They walked to her car like that. The prior commission was delivered in the second week of November. Ryan drove out to Franklin with Danny to manage the delivery and installation. His knee was healed enough for driving. His ribs still a consideration, but not a prohibition. Margaret Pryor met them in the driveway and walked them through the house to the dining room and stood back when the table was in place. And she did exactly what she'd done when she came to check on its progress in the shop. She looked at it for a moment and then she cried. The same kind, not sad. The other kind. Her husband came in from the kitchen and stood next to her and looked at the table and then at her and said, that's the one, she said. Ryan drove back to Millhaven and called Laura from the car and told her about it, and she listened and then said, of course, she cried. It's a beautiful table and it's exactly what she needed, and you knew that before she did. The antique brass drawer pulls were her idea, and you let her have the credit. She earned it. She was right. Laura was quiet for a moment. She stopped. That's different. Letting someone be right? Saying they earned it. Not just conceding the point. Actually giving her credit for knowing something. He drove for a moment in silence. Jeffrey and I have been working on the difference between letting people be right and actually believing they know something. Apparently they're not the same thing, and I have historically confused them. How's that going? Painfully. Usefully. In equal measure. That's what she said about good therapy. Apparently all good therapy feels the same from the inside and different from the outside. Don't put that on a mug. Too late. It's already a mug in my head. She laughed, and he could hear the October turn November evening around her wherever she was, and he thought, this is the ordinary thing I was missing. Not a version of her preserved in amber. The actual person, right now, with whatever she was carrying today, and whatever she'd figured out this week, and whatever she thought about the mug idea. The actual person, the one he'd spent 2 years forgetting to want to know. December came in cold and stayed that way. Laura told him, over soup at his kitchen table on a Wednesday evening in early December, about the 7-year-old with selective mutism. Not the clinical details. Those were the child's, not Ryan's to know, but the shape of it, the arc of the last month. How the child had, in their 4th session, said one word, not to her, to a toy the child had been carrying around and repositioning for 3 weeks, but said it, out loud. In the room, what was the word? Ryan said. She looked at him. I can't tell you that, I know. I'm asking anyway, she almost told him. He could see her deciding not to. She stopped. It was the right word, for what was happening in that moment. It was exactly the right word. Okay, he said. She looked at him for a moment. You're not going to push, it's not mine to push for. She was quiet. Then, that's also different. Jeffrey and I have been working on the distinction between wanting to know something and being entitled to know it. How long are you and Jeffrey going to be working on things? He says as long as it's useful. I asked him to define useful. He said that was a good question to sit with. Ryan picked up his spoon. I'm sitting with it. She refilled his soup without asking, and he saw her notice that she'd done it, and he saw her decide not to make anything of it, and that was its own kind of progress. The fluency of 2 people relearning that small gestures were allowed to just be small gestures. She told him she was going to stay in Nashville through the new year. The program she coordinated had an intensive period in January, and she needed to be there for it. He'd known this was coming. She'd mentioned it earlier in November, and again at Thanksgiving, which they'd spent separately with their respective families, and then together at his house on the Friday after, which was the best Friday he'd had in years. I'll be back in February, she said. Regularly, I mean. The intense period ends and my schedule normalizes. Okay, he said. You're very calm about this. You have a job you're good at and it requires you to be somewhere. That's not a crisis. He paused. I know the difference now between you being somewhere else and you being gone. They're not the same thing. She looked at him for a long moment. No, she said. They're not. She drove back to Nashville 2 days before Christmas, and he drove up to Phoenix with Nicole to see his parents, and they texted through the holiday with the ease of 2 people who had figured out that being in different places for a few weeks was not the same as being apart in the way that mattered. On New Year's Eve, he called her at 11:45 and they talked until midnight and a few minutes past it, talking about nothing in particular. A show she was watching, a commission he was planning, the fact that his father had said something at Christmas dinner that was either very wise or completely accidental, and he couldn't determine which. What did he say? She asked. He said, "The trick is to keep showing up before you figure out why you're showing up. The figuring out comes later." A pause. I like that. I couldn't tell if he was talking about marriage or the woodworking club he just joined. Maybe both, he agreed. They said goodnight and Happy New Year and hung up, and he sat in his parents' guest room in Phoenix and thought about the year ending and what the next one was going to contain. Not with anxiety, with something closer to straightforward interest, which was new. The future had been, for most of the last 2 years, a thing he looked at sideways, aware it was there, unwilling to look at it directly, because looking at it directly required having a plan, and having a plan required knowing what he wanted, and knowing what he wanted required being honest about the fact that what he wanted was Laura, and he wasn't ready to do anything about that. He was ready now. He was, in fact, already doing something about it. January passed in the working way of Januaries, cold and purposeful, stripped of the pretense of other seasons. Ryan started a new commission, a set of bookshelves for a professor, Cherrywood, straightforward brief. He went to his Tuesday sessions with Jeffrey, and they talked about the architecture of avoidance, which Jeffrey said was the term for the sophisticated system Ryan had built to feel busy and connected without actually being vulnerable to anything. It's a good system, Jeffrey said. In the measured way, he said things that weren't compliments but weren't criticisms either, just observations with doors in them. It kept you safe. It also kept you alone. I know, Ryan said. How does it feel to be dismantling it? Ryan thought about it. Like good carpentry. You have to be careful you're not just removing structure for the sake of removing structure. Some of the structure was holding real weight. He paused. But there was a lot that was just filling space. Jeffrey wrote something. Say that again, slower. He fixed the third porch step on a Saturday in the third week of January when the temperature had lifted briefly, and the ground was dry enough to work. 22 minutes. The radio on. A country station, real fiddles, the kind of music that told you something was happening to the people in the song, without explaining it too much. He stood when he was done and stepped on the repaired board. Once, twice, solid underfoot, and felt the uncomplicated satisfaction of a thing that had needed doing being done. He texted Laura a photo of the step. She texted back, "About time." He texted 22 minutes. She texted, "Nicole owes me $5. He texted, "You two have a problem." She texted back a laughing face and then, after a moment, "I'll be back in 3 weeks." The program wraps February 14th. He looked at that for a moment. He texted, February 14th. She texted, "I know. Don't make it weird." He texted, "I have a reservation at Miller's." A pause. "Then you made a reservation." He texted, 2 months ago." Another pause longer. Then, Ryan Mitchell. He texted Laura Callahan. Another pause. Then, "I'll be there." February in Tennessee arrived gray and cold and without apology, which was appropriate. February didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. It was the month that showed you what was left after everything decorative had been stripped away. The bones of the trees, the gray of the fields, the particular quality of light that didn't flatter anything but revealed everything clearly. Laura drove from Nashville on a Saturday, 2 weeks before Valentine's Day, because the program had wrapped early and she had appointments to reschedule and preferred to do it from her own apartment. She texted from the road. She texted again when she stopped for coffee. She texted when she crossed the county line, which was not a thing she'd done before, and which Ryan understood was not a navigation update, but a form of arrival announcement. "I am on my way and telling you I am on my way." He was in the shop when she texted the county line. He looked at the text and looked up at the west window where the February light was doing the flat, clarifying thing it did this time of year, and he thought, 6 months ago I woke up in a hospital bed and didn't know which direction was forward. He knew now. He set down the hand plane he'd been using and texted back, "I'll put the coffee on." She came to the shop first, before going home to her apartment, which she said was because she was driving past it anyway. This was true and also not the whole reason, and they both understood that without discussing it. She stood in the doorway of the shop and looked at the space. The bench where she'd sat 6 months ago in October, the radio in its corner, the smell of sawdust and linseed oil, the afternoon light. Then she looked at him. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. She came in and kissed him hello the way you kiss someone you've been kissing for a while and are glad to see. Without ceremony, without the weight of occasion, with the ease of something that has become ordinary in the right way. "You smell like a workshop," she said. "I am in a workshop." "You always smell like a workshop." This seems to have been established previously and accepted. She looked around the shop. At the new commission on the bench, the bookshelves, cherry wood, clean joinery, more intricate than the prior table in some ways, simpler in others. She came over and looked at it the way she looked at his work, which was with genuine attention, not the performed appreciation of someone being polite, but the interest of someone who had spent enough time around the making of things to understand what she was looking at. How long, she said. 3 more weeks. The professor is very clear about what she wants, which makes everything easier. Unlike some clients. Though I've come around on the drawer pull situation as a general matter, Laura looked at him. You've come around on clients changing their minds. I've come around on the idea that people knowing what they want and saying so is a feature, not a problem. He paused. Jeffrey might take some credit for that one. She put her hand on the cherry wood, feeling the grain the way he'd taught her 2 years ago. Not pressing but resting, letting the surface tell you something rather than demanding it. It's beautiful, she said. The professor is going to love it, that's what I'm told. She looked up at him. There was something in her expression that was settled and warm, and also, underneath both of those, still a little careful. The carefulness of someone who was choosing to trust something rather than assuming it, which was a different and more honest thing. I have an appointment Monday, she said, at the new clinic I'm joining. For the interview, he blinked. New clinic? In Millhaven, she said it watching him. There's a pediatric program attached to the children's hospital here that's been trying to fill a coordinating position for 8 months. I applied in December, he looked at her. You applied in December. I wanted to know if it was real before I told you. I didn't want you to. She paused. I didn't want the information to change what we were doing. I wanted what we were doing to stay what it was while I figured out whether this was actually a thing. And is it actually a thing? They want to offer me the position. Monday is the final interview, which is really a formality. She looked at him steadily. I'm telling you now because I made a decision. The decision is mine. It's based on the work, and whether the program is the right fit, and whether this is the right next step for what I'm building professionally. She paused. And also because I want to be in the same city as you, and I'm allowed to want that, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Ryan looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the Thursday 2 years ago, when she'd told him about the Nashville position, and asked what he thought, and he said, you should take it, and meant it as love and delivered it as absence. He thought about the version of that moment he was inside of right now and how different it felt. Not because the stakes were smaller. Because he understood what he was actually saying. The program sounds right for you, he said. From what you've told me about the work you've been doing, the advocacy model you've been building, this is the next step. You'd be good at it. He paused. And I would very much like you to be in the same city. She looked at him for a long moment. That's the right answer, she said. I know. You've been practicing. I've been learning. There's a difference. She came around the bench and stood in front of him and put her hand against his jaw and looked at him with the full, unguarded attention she gave to things that required it, and what lived in her expression was not the hope from a drawer, the crumpled, cautious hope of the hospital room. It was something more current. Something that had been tested and had held. Okay, she said. He kissed her in the shop, with sawdust on the floor and the west window open a few inches to the cold February air, and it was the kind of kiss that didn't need to be anything other than what it was. Two people who had figured something out choosing to be where they were. He built the table in April, not because April was significant. Because April was when the walnut was ready, when the commission queue had a gap of 2 weeks, when the light through the west window was back to the amber it had been in October but warmer now, carrying the beginning of something, rather than the end. He'd had the wood since, before the accident, a slab he'd pulled from the inventory in Ensig 8 months ago, and set aside because it had something in it that didn't belong in a commission piece. The grain ran in a particular way that suggested the tree had grown in a difficult place, had spent years adjusting to conditions that weren't ideal, and had become, in the process of that adjustment, something more interesting than a tree that had simply grown straight. He worked on it in the evenings after the shop closed, after Laura had come and gone, or was sitting at his old desk doing her own work, the sounds of their separate focuses making a kind of comfortable counterpoint in the space. The maple line running through the center was deliberate, not compensating for anything, not filling a gap. A thin, clean line of a lighter wood through the darker one, because the table had been made from 2 things, and it didn't need to pretend otherwise. Because the line was honest. Because honesty in the materials was the first principle of making something that would last. He finished the table on a Saturday morning in late April, stood back and looked at it in the morning light, the grain, the surface, the maple line running clean and clear through the center, and thought, that's the one. Laura came to the shop at noon in jeans and an old sweater, her hair loose, carrying 2 coffees from the place on Commerce. She'd been doing that lately, bringing coffee to the shop on Saturday mornings, which had become a kind of standing arrangement without either of them formally proposing it. She stopped when she saw the table. She came closer, put her hand on it the way she always touched his work, with full attention, palm flat, feeling the surface honestly. Her fingers moved along the maple line. Ryan, she said, I know, it's the best thing you've made. Yes, she looked up at him. Who is it for? Us, he said. It's for the kitchen. When he stopped. Started again, more carefully, the way Jeffrey had taught him to start again, when he caught himself using vagueness as a hedge against commitment. When you move in, if you want to. I'm not asking you to decide right now, but I built it for this kitchen, for whatever this kitchen becomes, and I wanted you to know that. She looked at the table, then at him, then back at the table. It needs chairs, she said. I know. I have opinions about the chairs. Of course you do. 4 to start. 6 is more practical. 6, she said. If we're having people over, when we're having people over, she looked at him. Something moved through her expression, the full range of it, from the careful to the certain, and it wasn't performing either. It was just true. Okay, she said. 3rd time she'd said that word to him in a way that mattered. He'd learned to pay attention to the weight of it. He kissed her there, with sawdust on the floor and the west window open to the Tennessee spring, with her coffee going cold on the workbench and the table behind them finished and waiting. And it was not careful the way the hospital had been careful. It was present. The room smelled like walnut and the sweet particular thing that April smelled like in Tennessee, the thing he'd never been able to name. Something blooming, something green, something that had made it through the winter. He pulled back and looked at her. She had sawdust on her sweater, a streak of it at the elbow from leaning against the bench. She hadn't noticed. He didn't mention it because he liked it there, the evidence of the place she was standing in, his shop on a Saturday in April, having decided to be exactly here. Chairs, she said. I'll start on them next week, 4 first. We can add 2 later, that's very reasonable of you. I'm a reasonable person, you are, he said. You also cried at the Paul and the Cornbread episode. He mentioned his grandmother in 1 sentence. It was a heavy sentence, she laughed. The kind that was fully hers, that didn't hold anything back. The laugh he'd spent 23 months not hearing, and had now heard often enough that it had become part of the acoustics of his life. They carried the table out of the shop together. His ribs were long-heeled, his knee fully functional, his hands on one end and hers on the other, navigating the door and the path and the porch, with its repaired 3rd step, solid underfoot, no longer a recurring item on any list, and into the kitchen. They set it down. It fit the kitchen the way things fit when they were made for the space. Not just dimensionally, but in the way it occupied the room. The walnut and the maple in the light from the window, the grain of it, the table that said this kitchen was worth building for, without saying anything at all. Sandra came that evening with pie. She'd been coming for Sunday dinners since February, which had begun because Ryan had called her to say Laura was interviewing for the Millhaven position. And Sandra had appeared 2 days later, with a casserole and the expression of a woman who understood that some situations required casseroles. The Sunday dinners had continued because they all found them useful, and because Sandra was, in the way of people who have always been honest with their faces, visibly happy at the sight of Ryan and Laura at the same table, and her happiness was the uncomplicated kind that made a room feel larger. She set the pie on the counter and walked into the kitchen and stopped when she saw the table. Oh, she said. Her voice did the thing it did, Mom, Laura said. A warning, but a fond one. I'm not saying anything, Sandra said. I'm just, she looked at the table. Then at Ryan. You made this for here? Yes, he said. Sandra pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling and composed herself with the effort of a woman who had been composing herself in Ryan's presence for approximately 6 years and had gotten better at it without ever fully mastering it. The maple line, she said, down the center. Yes, she looked at it for a long moment. It's honest, she said. It doesn't pretend it wasn't made from 2 things. Ryan looked at her. No, it doesn't. Sandra nodded once, picked up her pie and put it on the counter, and started looking for a knife with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had said what she came to say and was now ready to do something practical. They ate dinner at the new table. The three of them, with the April evening coming through the kitchen window, and the candles Sandra had produced from her bag because she always brought candles to things, and nobody ever questioned it anymore. The pie after. Nicole was coming next Sunday with her new boyfriend, who Ryan had not yet met, and about whom Nicole had said only that he was, not like the last one, which is a recommendation, and about whom Laura had said, when Ryan reported this, that's an extremely low bar and also probably sufficient. The evening was ordinary in all the ways that mattered. Sandra told a story about a dispute at the church fundraiser. Laura told a story about a colleague's attempt to install a standing desk in a space that was too small for one, then never ringing. Ryan told them about the professor's bookshelves, which had been delivered the previous Tuesday, and which the professor had called about the next morning to say they looked exactly like they'd always been there. "That's the best thing you can say, Sandra said. "That's what I thought," Ryan said. Laura looked at him across the table, across the walnut and maple, across the grain, across the thing he'd built for this kitchen, and the look she gave him was clear and warm and without performance. Not the hope from the drawer, the current thing. The thing that had been tested. Later, after Sandra had gone home and they'd washed the dishes, and the kitchen was quiet, Laura stood at the table and ran her hand along the maple line one more time. "You know what I keep thinking about," she said. "What, that woman, Margaret Pryor, who cried over a table, what about her?" Laura looked up. She said there wasn't going to be a right time. There was just time. She looked back at the maple line. "I've been thinking about all the time I spent waiting for things to be right rather than just present in my own life. Not just with you," she paused. "The work I'm going to do at the new clinic. The things I've been building toward. I kept waiting until everything was arranged properly, until I was certain." She looked at him. "Certain is a story we tell ourselves. It's not real. Present is real." He thought about that. Jeffrey says something similar. He says commitment isn't certainty. It's action in the presence of uncertainty. Jeffrey sounds like he should be on a mug. "I told you there was going to be a mug." She laughed and came around the table and stood close to him, and put her head against his chest. He put his hand at the back of her neck, in her hair, and they stood there in the kitchen in the April evening, not because there was anything left to resolve, but because this was where they were. Outside, the maple tree at the edge of the property had its new leaves on. Pale green, just opened, the particular green of things that have made it through to the other side of winter. The kind of green that doesn't announce itself, just arrives one morning and is simply there, inside the kitchen. The table. The two of them not fixed, not finished, not the destination, but the living direction of a thing in motion, choosing, with full awareness of the cost of the alternative, to be exactly here. He held her in the kitchen that smelled like walnut and pie, and the April evening coming through the window, and he thought about the morning he'd woken up in a hospital bed, and not known which direction was forward, and he thought about the months since, and the work since, and all the ordinary Thursdays and Saturdays that had made up the distance between that morning and this one, and he thought, this is what waking up actually feels like. Not the hospital, not the dramatic moment, just this, the person you chose, still here, still choosing back.